I was never the kind of person who believed every strange thing was something creepy. Most of the time, I'm the first person to look for a normal explanation. Animals, bad visibility, people messing around, whatever. But there is one night from a few years ago that, well, it still bothers me because I just cannot explain what we saw. This happened in the fall of 2023 when two of my friends and I decided to take my SUV out into a remote area of northern Michigan. We weren't doing anything serious. We had recently installed some new off-road tires and we wanted to see how they handled an old service road and trails before winter came in. The area that we went to was the kind of place where you could drive for an hour and barely see another person. There were some old hunting cabins there, old maintenance roads, and huge stretches of forest where the trees blocked out almost everything around you. During the day it was quite nice actually, but at night it certainly got a little bit eerie out there. Anyway, we entered the trail system just before sunset, but we underestimated how quickly it would get dark out there. And by the time that we were a few miles in, it was pitch black except for our headlights. The first thing that felt strange, too, was a light. You see, far ahead of us, somewhere between the trees, there was a small white light that kept appearing and disappearing. At first, we assumed it was another person camping, or maybe somebody checking traps or hunting equipment or something. But the weird part was that, no matter how far we drove, it just never seemed to get any closer. We would go around a bend, drive another few minutes, and the light would still be sitting roughly in the same place. It wasn't moving toward us, but it wasn't staying in one obvious location either. We joked about it at first. One of my friends said that maybe someone was walking through the woods carrying a flashlight and trying to mess with us as well. But then we heard an engine. A truck suddenly came flying down the trail toward us from the opposite direction. The road was barely wide enough for one vehicle, and there were deep puddles and loose rocks everywhere. Whoever was driving was moving way too fast for the conditions. The truck bounced over the rough ground, barely slowing for turns, and passed us so quickly that I barely had time to see the driver. What stood out was just how stressed this person looked. It wasn't someone having fun driving fast or anything like that. It looked like someone trying to get away from something. Well, the truck disappeared around the corner and all three of us just sort of sat there for a moment. That was when we decided that we were done. We turned around and we headed back toward the main road. A few minutes later, we saw someone standing beside the trail, and at first we thought that it was another person who had gotten stuck or needed help or whatever. But as we got closer, we realized that it was a woman with a backpack and a bicycle. That immediately seemed really strange. I mean, it was getting close to midnight now, the temperature had dropped, and the trail was muddy enough that our vehicle was covered in dirt and barely making it through, but she looked completely untouched. Her clothes were clean, her shoes were clean, and her bike didn't have the usual mud and scratches that you would expect from riding those trails. She wasn't looking at us either. She was just standing there beside the bike, staring down the trail behind us. My friend, he rolled down the window and asked if she needed some help, but she didn't respond. She didn't even glance at us. After a few seconds, she simply got on the bike and, well, she started riding. We thought at first that maybe she hadn't heard us, so we slowly continued driving behind her, and that's when things started getting weird. So the trail eventually connected to a paved road that led toward the nearest town, and we assumed that we would pass her almost immediately once we got onto the smoother road. But we didn't. She somehow stayed ahead of us. At first we thought that she was faster than expected. Maybe she was an experienced cyclist or something. But the longer it went on, the weirder it became. We were driving maybe around 35 miles per hour because the road was narrow and full of curves, and somehow she stayed the same distance ahead of us, not gaining distance and not falling behind, but just staying right there. My friend joked that maybe she was some professional cyclist training for a race, but Nobody was really laughing anymore at this. When we reached a longer straight section, I sped up a bit. I went from 40 miles to about almost 60, and the cyclist still didn't disappear. She remained far enough ahead that we couldn't get close to her, but close enough that we could just see her clear silhouette. I remember at this point gripping the steering wheel and thinking that there had to be some sort of an explanation for this. Maybe the road was shorter than I realized. Maybe there was some sort of trick of the headlights or something going on. But nothing made sense. And this continued for like several miles, and there were multiple witnesses to this. Well, finally we reached the outskirts of town and came to an intersection with a gas station nearby. I slowed down because I wanted to see where she would go, and the moment that I looked away to check traffic and looked back, she was just gone. Mind you, there were no side roads nearby, no driveways, no place that she could have really turned, just a straight road behind us. All of us were just completely silent at this point. Nobody wanted to say what we were thinking. We drove to the gas station and stayed there for about 20 minutes, just talking and trying to convince ourselves that there must be some sort of a normal explanation for this. Maybe she just turned off and we didn't notice. Maybe the darkness made us misjudge the distance. Maybe we're just tired and seeing things. Those are the explanations that I still tell myself, but there is one thing that I still cannot explain. You see, the next morning when I looked at the vehicle, there were fresh muddy handprints on the passenger side door. Honestly too, at first I thought that one of my friends had done this as a joke, but I confirmed with them that they hadn't. None of us had touched that side of the vehicle after leaving the trail that night. And while I don't know if that's actually related to what happened, it is a strange detail, right? I don't know who that cyclist was or why she was out there that night. Maybe there is a completely normal explanation for everything that happened, but I don't really think so. And I haven't been back to those trails to this day. I was 23 when I moved into an older apartment building near my university while finishing a demanding professional course too. The building used to be a government office before being converted into student housing, and whoever renovated it clearly cared more about making it functional than making it comfortable. My room was on the highest floor, at the end of a long hallway that most people barely used. The building was mostly occupied by undergraduates, but my floor was supposed to be reserved for postgraduate students who wanted a quieter environment. In reality, though, almost everyone had moved out by the middle of the semester, leaving only a handful of people scattered throughout the building. At first, I actually enjoyed the quiet too. I had a small room, a desk by the window, and enough space to study without distractions. My days became pretty repetitive too. Wake up, attend some lectures, come back, study until late, sleep, and repeat. The problem, though, was that the isolation slowly started affecting me in a weird way. You see, after a few months, I noticed that I was becoming sort of unusually jumpy. I would hear footsteps outside of my room, and I would assume that somebody was there, only to open the door and find an empty hallway. Sometimes I thought that I saw movement near the end of the corridor, but when I looked properly, there was nothing there. I was sleeping pretty poorly and putting myself under ridiculous pressure. Medical exams have a way of making every little thing feel bigger than it is. But then small things started happening that were harder to ignore. I began finding my door slightly open when I was certain that I had closed it. I would come back from class and notice that my chair was pulled away from my desk, even though I always push it in before leaving. I assumed that I was just forgetting. That sounds ridiculous, I know, but when you're exhausted, your own memory becomes pretty unreliable, let me tell you. So I convinced myself that I was just making some mistakes. But the thing that really bothered me was the feeling that someone was around when nobody was really there. It wasn't anything objective, it was more like a constant awareness that I was being sort of watched. For instance, I would be sitting at my desk studying and would suddenly feel the need to turn around. But every time, there was nothing, just my room, just the empty hallway outside. Eventually, I started avoiding being there as well. I stayed in the library longer, walked around campus after class a bit more, and only returned to my apartment when I had to actually sleep. And then one night, everything sort of came to a head. Now, I'd been studying until almost 3 in the morning when I finally went to bed, and I remember waking up suddenly, but I just couldn't move. At first, I thought that I was still dreaming. I tried to lift my arms, but nothing happened. I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't work. And then I noticed something else. My bedroom door, which I always locked before sleeping, looked like it was slightly open. I couldn't see anyone standing there, but my brain immediately went into panic mode. I felt trapped. I was completely convinced that somebody had entered my room and I was lying there unable to do anything about it. The entire episode probably lasted less than a minute, but man, it felt so much longer than that. Eventually, I managed to move my hand, then my arm, and I sat up so quickly that I nearly fell out of bed. The strangest thing, though, was that while the room was empty, the door was actually open. Well, the next morning I packed a bag and I went to stay with a friend. I didn't care about the inconvenience. I didn't care about the money that I was wasting. I just needed to leave that building for a bit. A few days later, I decided to go back and collect the rest of my things late at night because I didn't want to run into anyone. So I took a bus across town and got off near the apartment complex. That's when something really strange happened. The street outside the building was completely empty, like completely empty. The lights were on, the shops nearby were closed, and cars occasionally passed on the main road, but the entire block felt, almost like it was abandoned. I stood there for a few seconds with my key in my hand and had this overwhelming feeling that I just should not go inside. There was no logical reason for this. It was just a sudden wave of just anxiety that I had never felt before. I almost laughed at myself because I knew how irrational it all sounded. I was standing outside of my own apartment building after all, scared of walking through my own front door. I eventually forced myself inside though, and when I reached my floor, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Every door along the hallway was now open. Not wide open, but just slightly cracked open, but each exactly like the other. I knew that that was completely weird and unusual because the building, well, it had automatic door closers and people normally kept their doors shut. I walked back downstairs and contacted the building manager, and the next day they checked the hallway cameras. Apparently someone had been entering the floor late at night while I was away, and they weren't a resident, and they had been following other people through the security entrance and wandering around the building. They weren't caught doing anything serious, but security footage showed them spending a lot of time near my room for some reason. But that certainly explained some things. I mean, the door being open, the feeling of somebody being nearby, the reason I kept hearing movement outside. But it certainly didn't explain everything, right? Anyway, I moved out permanently after that, and when I told my parents what had happened, my mother admitted something that surprised me. She said that she had been worried for months because every time that I called, I sounded exhausted and really unlike myself. She thought that it was just the pressure of school, and honestly, so did I, but looking back, I think the isolation and the stress made me ignore obvious warning signs. I was so focused on explaining everything away that I didn't consider the simplest possibility that somebody really had been around. I finished my exams eventually, and I moved into a brighter apartment closer to campus. I have roommates now too, a much more normal routine, and I make a point of not shutting myself away for days at a time anymore. I still get that uneasy feeling occasionally when I'm studying late at night, but now instead of assuming that I'm imagining things, I just check the locks, look around, and pay attention to everything. Because, as I've learned, sometimes the things making you uncomfortable aren't just your imagination. Sometimes your instincts are noticing something before your brain even catches up. I was 8 years old when my family moved into a house at the edge of a small desert town in New Mexico. It wasn't exactly isolated, but our street backed onto a huge stretch of undeveloped land, so once you were in the backyard, all you could see were dirt trails, scrub, and miles of empty space. At the time, I thought that this was the coolest place in the world. My parents had bought the house because it was bigger than our old one, and my siblings and I finally had room to spread out a bit. The living room became the main gathering spot too. We had an old couch, a TV, a bunch of board games, and a cheap basketball hoop in the driveway that my dad had installed himself. Everything felt pretty normal. The first strange thing happened on a weekend evening when my whole family was together. My sister had just left the living room to walk her friend outside after he dropped something off. My parents were sitting on the couch talking, and I was on the floor messing around and trying to make everybody laugh. But above the entertainment center was a large framed mirror that had been hanging there since we had moved in. It wasn't decorative glass or anything lightweight. It was actually a heavy wooden frame that my dad had anchored into the wall because he didn't want it falling during storms. While we were talking, there was suddenly a loud crack. The mirror didn't fall slowly, too. It came away from the wall instantly. I remember watching it sort of tilt forward and drop almost straight down, then swing upward before hitting the carpet. It missed the coffee table by inches and landed right where I had been sitting just moments earlier, and everyone froze. My dad immediately stood up and checked the wall. The strange part was that the mounting hardware wasn't completely broken or anything. One of the anchors had pulled loose from the drywall, but the screws themselves were still partially attached. My dad kept saying that it just didn't make any sense because the mirror should have fallen straight down, not swung outward like that. He spent the next hour trying to figure out what had happened, in fact. Maybe somebody had bumped the wall, or maybe the anchor was damaged. Maybe he just installed it incorrectly. Those explanations were possible, and certainly were things that he considered, but it was the timing of it that really bothered everyone. After that, we became way more aware of things around the house too, and over the next months, small issues kept happening. Cabinet doors that had been left closed would sometimes be open when we came back into the kitchen. Items on shelves would occasionally end up moved from somewhere that we remembered leaving them. At first, we blamed each other because that's what families do, right? My brothers and sisters would accuse one another of messing around, and my parents would assume that we had forgotten things. But then, there were things that were harder to explain. Like, one night my dad heard what sounded like somebody moving around in the garage. He assumed one of us had gone outside, so he walked down the hallway and called out, but nobody answered. When he opened the garage door, the lights were off and nobody was there. A strange part, too, was that a stack of storage boxes near the back wall had been moved. They weren't knocked over or anything, but they had definitely been shifted several feet, almost like somebody had been looking through them. My dad checked outside of the house even, but there were no footprints and no signs that anyone had been there. After that, though, he installed a small security camera near the back entrance. And a few weeks later, we discovered the actual problem. The camera caught a person entering our backyard late at night. It wasn't someone trying to break in. They weren't wearing a mask or acting aggressive or anything. They were just walking around the property, looking into windows and checking areas around the house. My parents contacted the police, and they eventually identified the person as someone who had lived several streets away, apparently. They had been struggling with personal issues and had been wandering into neighbors' yards at night, allegedly. That explained a lot. I mean, the moved objects, the garage noises, the feeling that someone had been around when nobody was supposed to be there. My parents never told us kids everything at the time because they didn't want to scare us, but years later they admitted that they had been worried for months about this. We eventually moved after all this, and the new house didn't feel strange at all. Nothing happened there, no unexplained noises, no missing objects, no uneasy feeling that someone was nearby or anything like that. But looking back though, I think what scared me most about that old house wasn't actually the mirror falling or the weird things happening inside. It was realizing that none of this was attached to a ghost or anything, but a real person who had allegedly broken into our house at different times and maybe even while we were there. As a kid, I thought the house itself was the problem, but now I realize that it had nothing to do with that. Before we continue with tonight's scary stories, I want to tell you about a company that has actually become a part of my routine lately, Quince. Now, where I live, we're right in the middle of winter, and if you know me, then you know a lot of my time is spent sitting down, researching, writing, and preparing for creepy stories that I bring to you guys every week. And when I'm working late at night putting these episodes together, staying comfortable really matters. That's why I've been using some pieces from Quince, and I was genuinely impressed by the quality. I've been wearing their cashmere trouser socks while I'm working, and they're one of those small upgrades that you don't really think about until you have them. They're incredibly soft, warm, and they've quickly become something that I reach for when I'm sitting here for hours putting these stories together, or watching a late night show, or even if I'm just up late researching or something. In fact, I've been using them so often that they've been dubbed my research socks in my family. I've also been using their chunky hand-knit wool throw, and during those colder nights, it's been perfect. I mean, there's just something about being wrapped up in a warm blanket, a hot drink nearby, and working through some unsettling stories in the quiet of the evening that just fits the whole atmosphere of what I do here. What I like about Quince too is that they focus on fewer, better pieces. They make everyday essentials using premium materials, designed to last and become the things that you keep coming back to. They have everything too, from ultra-soft organic cotton tees and premium Mongolian cashmere sweaters to everyday staples like denim and tailored chinos. These are the kind of pieces that work whether you're relaxing at home, heading out, or just upgrading the basics that you wear every day. And the reason that Quince can offer this quality at a lower price is because they work directly with ethical factories and cut out the traditional middlemen. Their products are actually typically 50 to 80% less than similar items from comparable brands because you're paying for the materials and the craftsmanship rather than a huge brand markup. For me, the biggest surprise was how premium these pieces feel while you're still being practical. They're not things that you buy and leave sitting in the cupboard. They're things that you actually use, and it's not just clothing either. Quince also has hotel-quality bedding, bath essentials, premium cookware, and travel items too. So, support the show and upgrade your everyday. Download the Quince app for app-exclusive offers, or go to quince.com/bescared. Get free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada and the UK too. That's QUINCE.com/bescared. I was hiking alone in Northern California a couple of years ago on a trail that wasn't really maintained anymore. It wasn't marked on most maps, but locals used it to get to an old viewpoint area. I liked finding places that weren't crowded, and that afternoon I wanted to spend a few hours away from people. It was early autumn, I think, and the forest was pretty quiet in a way where you noticed every little sound. The ground was damp from recent rain, and the trees were thick enough that the sunlight barely reached the trail. After about an hour of walking, I started hearing something strange. It sounded like movement deeper in the woods, but not like an animal moving through brush. It was more like somebody dragging something heavy over the ground. I would hear it for a few seconds, and then it would stop. At first, I convinced myself that it was probably just a fallen branch shifting, or maybe another hiker somewhere nearby. Eventually, I reached a small clearing off of the main path. It looked like somebody had been using the area recently. There was flattened grass, a couple of cut branches, and a makeshift sitting area with old pieces of wood arranged around a fire pit. That alone wasn't unusual, but That alone wasn't unusual. People camp in random places all the time. What bothered me, though, was just how fresh everything looked. The wood wasn't weathered. The ashes in the fire pit looked recent. There were empty food wrappers tucked underneath one of the logs, and a plastic container sitting nearby that had a little bit of water inside. Someone had clearly been there recently, but I hadn't seen anyone on the trail all day. I immediately felt uncomfortable, though, and I decided to leave. I packed up and I started heading back the way that I had come. I had only gone a few minutes, too, when I noticed something that made me stop. There was a backpack leaning against a tree about 30 yards away, and it had not been there on the way in. I stood there for a while trying to figure out if I had somehow missed it, but I was almost certain that it wasn't there before. It was an older hiking backpack too, dark in color, sitting upright against a trunk like somebody had intentionally placed it there. I didn't want to touch it, so I kept walking and took a really wide berth around it. But that was when I heard footsteps. Not animal sounds or branches moving or anything like that. Actual footsteps. They were coming from behind me, matching my pace. I would walk faster and they would speed up. I would stop and they would stop too. At first I thought that maybe another hiker was nearby and I was making myself nervous, but when I turned around, there was never anyone on the trail. I called out asking if somebody was there, but there was no response. I waited for a few seconds, then started walking again. This time I didn't stop though. I kept moving toward the main trail while trying not to look back every few seconds. When I reached a more open section of the forest, I finally turned around, and that's when I saw someone standing between the trees. It was a man, maybe in his 40s or 50s, and he was far enough away that I couldn't make out many details, but he was standing completely still, watching the trail. The weird part was that he wasn't dressed like somebody hiking. He wasn't carrying any gear, and he didn't have a backpack. He was just standing there in regular clothes. I called out again, asking if he needed help, but he didn't answer. He just turned and walked back into the trees. Well, that was enough for me. I got back into my car as quickly as I could, and I just left. When I got home, I searched the area online to see if there were any reports about people camping illegally or anything like that. I didn't find anything, but I did find a local hiking group where people talked about that section of the forest, and a few people mentioned avoiding the area because apparently there had been problems with someone setting up hidden camps and watching hikers or something. Nothing violent had been confirmed, but several people said that they had found abandoned gear, like temporary shelters and signs that someone had been staying there for long periods of time. A week later, I went back with a friend during the day because I wanted to prove to myself that I had just gotten spooked, but the clearing was still there, the fire pit was gone now, and the backpack wasn't there any longer either. But what really bothered me was that there were fresh footprints around the area that weren't ours, which meant, again, that someone had been there recently and seemingly had cleared out. We didn't stay for too long, and eventually we left, and I haven't been back there since. I still hike alone sometimes, but I'm way more careful about unofficial trails now for sure. I used to think that the biggest danger in the woods was getting lost or running into wildlife or something, but these days I think the scariest thing about being somewhere isolated like that is realizing that you might not be the only person who knows that that place exists. And being stalked like that on a trail all alone, well, let me tell you that I do not recommend. So I was living in southern Arizona at the time, and a few friends and I used to spend a lot of nights exploring places that most people didn't bother going to. We weren't doing anything dangerous on purpose or illegal or anything. We were just young, bored, and always looking for somewhere different to hang out, I think. Anyway, one weekend a few of us decided to drive out to an old abandoned mining area outside of town. There were leftover structures from when the site was active decades earlier, including concrete foundations, rusted equipment, and some old access roads that had mostly been taken over by desert plants now. It was the kind of place where you could stand in one direction and see nothing but empty land for miles, too. There were 4 of us that night. We brought some drinks, flashlights, and just sort of walked around looking at the old buildings and whatnot. We spent a couple of hours exploring, taking pictures, and messing around inside some of the abandoned structures, too. At first, everything was normal. The only sounds were the wind, the insects, and the occasional noise from the metal structures shifting in the cold air. Now, around midnight, we were sitting near one of the old concrete buildings when my friend, Tyler, suddenly stopped talking and looked toward the far side of the property. He asked if any of us had brought a flashlight. We all said no. About 100 yards away, though, near a collapsed storage shed, there was a small light moving slowly between the bushes. It wasn't bright like a flashlight beam. It looked more like a dim glow coming from a lantern or a phone screen covered by something. It would appear, disappear behind the brush, and then show up again a few feet away. At first we assumed it was another group exploring the area too. That wasn't completely unusual. People would sometimes go out there to take pictures or ride dirt bikes and stuff like that. So we called out, asking if somebody was nearby. The light stopped moving, but nobody answered. After a few seconds, it started moving again, but this time it seemed to drift sideways instead of following a normal path. We couldn't see the person carrying it because the vegetation was too thick, but the light kept appearing in places that didn't seem easy to reach, that's for sure. We laughed about it at first because we were trying to convince ourselves that it was nothing, I think. But then we noticed that Emma's backpack was missing. She had left it beside us when we walked around the building, but now it was gone all of a sudden, and at first we thought that she had simply forgotten where she had put it, so we all grabbed our phones and we started searching. The problem, though, was that the area wasn't really all that big. We checked around the building, near the rocks and along the path that we had walked, but we just couldn't find it anywhere. Her backpack had her wallet, keys, and some other personal things inside, so we weren't just casually looking anymore, too. We were tearing through the area trying to find it. After maybe 20 minutes, Tyler noticed something a bit weird. There were some footprints near the back entrance of the building, and they weren't ours. The ground was dusty back there and soft enough that you could clearly see the pattern from somebody else's shoes. The prints, they came from the direction of the old shed and ended near where Emma's backpack had been sitting. That was the moment that the mood completely changed. But we weren't joking around anymore. Somebody else had clearly been close to us the entire time. We decided then that we needed to leave. We weren't interested in finding out who it was or whether they were still nearby, and as we walked back toward the vehicles, we kept our lights pointed around us. Nobody wanted to be the person walking at the back, though, and when we reached the parking area, I noticed something that made my stomach drop instantly. That same dim light was there again, except now it was way closer. It was sitting behind some bushes about 20 feet from where we had parked, and we all stopped immediately. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. The light didn't move toward us. It didn't flash or wave. It just stayed there. We got into the vehicles as quickly as we could, and we locked the doors instantly. While we were pulling away, I looked back through the window and saw the light still sitting in the same spot. It never followed us. It never moved. It just stayed there. Well, the next day, Emma checked her bank accounts and realized that her wallet had been taken from the backpack and a few other small items were missing too. We ended up reporting it, mostly because we wanted there to be a record in case other people had experienced something similar. The police, they weren't able to do much because there were no cameras and no clear suspect, obviously. But a few weeks later, one of my friends heard from someone who lived nearby that people had been breaking into abandoned areas around there and stealing from visitors, apparently. Also, some people would watch from a distance, apparently, and wait until groups left things unattended to go and snatch them. I don't know if that's exactly what happened to us, but it makes a lot more sense than anything else, really. The thing that still bothers me, though, is just how comfortable whoever it was seemed to be out there, all alone in the dark like that. I mean, who does that, right? Waits at abandoned places for people to show up just to steal from them? I often wonder, too, what would have happened if we had found this person and confronted them. I mean, they seem to have just been sitting there, watching four strangers wander around in the dark. That's pretty creepy, right? I still go exploring sometimes to this day, but I'm a lot more careful now for sure. I used to think that abandoned places were creepy because of what happened there years ago, but now I think that the real danger is the possibility that somebody else is there with you, and you just haven't even noticed them yet. I live in a suburb on the edge of a large park system in Northern California, and for most of my life, the trails around here have always felt completely harmless. They're the kind of places where families walk their dogs, people jog before work, and kids ride their bikes after school. The biggest wildlife concern has always been the occasional coyote or a rattlesnake during the warmer months. But that all changed recently after a few strange things started happening around one of the greenbelt areas near my neighborhood. The first thing that I heard about was from a guy who regularly walks his dog along the trails late at night. He's lived here for years and is the type of person who knows the area pretty well. He knows what animals are around, what noises are normal, and what's just part of living near open land. He posted in our neighborhood group saying that he had seen something unusual, though, near the edge of the trail. He didn't claim it was anything impossible. He actually seemed pretty embarrassed bringing it up, in fact. He said that he thought at first it was a large animal moving through the brush, but the way that it behaved really bothered him, apparently. And according to him, he saw something moving between the trees about 50 yards away, and at first he assumed it was a deer because of the size and the movement, but then it stopped. Instead of running away like most animals do when they notice people, it just sort of stayed there too. He said that it slowly backed away behind some trees while facing him, and that was really the part that bothered him the most. He said that it didn't move like something startled. It moved carefully, almost like it was trying not to be seen. A few nights later, another person commented that they had noticed something similar from their backyard. Their property backed up to the same stretch of undeveloped land, and they said that they had started hearing strange noises after dark, too. Not animal sounds that they recognized, at least. They described it as a mix between clicking and scratching, almost like something moving around in the bushes and making repeated short noises. They eventually took a picture when they saw movement near their fence line. The photo certainly wasn't clear. It was taken at night, and the camera automatically brightened everything, making the image blurry and sort of grainy. There was no way to identify exactly what it was in the end. But what certainly stood out was the shape. It looked like something crouched low near the trees. At first glance, I thought it was probably a person, to be honest. That honestly would have been worse too, but the problem was that the person who took the picture said that the movement didn't look human. They said that whatever it was stayed low to the ground and moved behind the bushes without ever standing up. The comments on the post went crazy about this. Some people said that it was probably a large animal seen from a strange angle. Other people suggested that somebody was trespassing and hiding in the brush, but that explanation made the most sense to me. A person watching houses from cover is a lot more realistic than anything else. Still, though, I stopped using that trail at night. Well, a few days later, I was driving home after work and passed the same area. It was already dark and the trail entrances were mostly empty. The streetlights along the road barely reached the tree line, and I slowed down for a second and looked toward the bushes, mostly out of curiosity, and I didn't see anything. But then, just as I was about to keep driving, something moved near the edge of the trees. It wasn't a clear shape, it was just a section of darkness shifting slightly, like something had moved from behind one of the bushes to another. I immediately looked away and kept driving, but The next morning I went back during daylight because I wanted to prove to myself that it was probably nothing. Now, near the area where I thought that I had seen movement, I noticed a small opening in the vegetation that I hadn't paid attention to before. There were flattened sections of grass leading deeper. Not an obvious trail, but just enough to suggest that something had been moving through there pretty regularly at least. A few feet away, tucked behind some bushes, I found an old blanket and some empty food wrappers. That was the moment that I stopped thinking about animals too. Whatever was happening here at least, something or someone had been spending time in that area for sure. I reported it to the local authorities, mostly because if there was a person hiding out there, I didn't want to ignore it. I never found out if anything came from the report, but the neighborhood group eventually stopped talking about it and people went back to using the trails during the day. But I still think about just how comfortable something had become living right next to us like that. That's the unsettling part about the suburban areas near open land. You start believing that because you have houses, streetlights, and sidewalks that there can't be anything or anyone hidden nearby. But there are still patches of trees and empty spaces where, well, nobody is looking. And sometimes I guess the scariest thing isn't discovering something strange in the wilderness, but it's realizing just how close the wilderness really is. I used to work a lot of odd hours because I liked having the extra money, if I'm being completely honest. I wasn't someone who enjoyed busy workplaces, so I eventually ended up taking a job at a small overnight storage facility just outside of the city that I live in. The job, it was pretty quiet. Most nights it was just me doing inventory checks, walking through the storage buildings, and making sure the loading areas were secure. There were cameras everywhere too, but the property was large and surrounded by empty lots, so there were still plenty of blind spots that needed to be looked at. I actually liked the isolation, but that all changed one night during a winter shift. It was around 2:30 in the morning, and I was doing my usual outside inspection before settling back into the office. The weather had been pretty bad for a few days at this stage, so the ground around the property was mostly wet dirt and gravel. When I reached the back section near the employee parking area, I noticed someone standing beyond the fence line. At first I thought it was just somebody walking along the road, but then I realized that they weren't moving. They were standing near an abandoned access road that led toward a patch of trees, just looking toward the facility. They weren't trying to hide it, but they also weren't acting like they belonged there or anything. The person, though, was wearing a dark jacket and work boots, and from where I was standing, I couldn't see their face clearly. What stood out, though, was just how still they were. They weren't checking their phone, looking around, or trying to get my attention or anything. They were just watching the property. I grabbed my flashlight and I pointed it in their direction. "Hey, this is private property. You need to move along." Most people would at least react to that. I mean, they'd turn around, wave, say something, or at the very least look surprised, but this person didn't. They stood there for another few seconds, then slowly turned away and walked toward the trees. They never looked back, and I went inside and wrote down what had happened in the shift log. I figured that it was probably somebody passing through the area or someone who had gotten confused about where they were or something. I tried not to think about it too much. Anyway, a few hours later, my shift ended and I went home for the night. I lived alone in a small apartment about 15 minutes away. My routine after work, too, was always the same. I'd grab something to eat, leave the blinds slightly open because I liked waking up with daylight, and just sleep for a few hours. That morning, I fell asleep almost immediately, too. When I woke up, though, something just felt wrong. I couldn't explain it at first, too. I mean, the apartment was quiet, nothing looked out of place, but I had that uncomfortable feeling that someone had been near me. I stayed still for a moment and looked toward the window, and that's when I noticed the mark. There was dirt smeared across the outside of the glass. Not just a random splash from rain or mud or anything, too. I mean, This was clearly a huge handprint. The fingers were faint, but the shape was very obvious. Someone had touched the window from the outside for sure. Mind you, the apartment was on the second floor, though. I remember just sort of staring at it, trying to convince myself that there was some normal explanation. Maybe maintenance had been outside, maybe something had hit the window, but the window was above a small patch of grass with no reason for anyone to be standing there. I grabbed my phone and checked the security camera footage from my apartment entrance. I had installed it after a package theft in the building, and I honestly wasn't expecting anything useful, but the footage showed somebody arriving early that morning, and it was the same person from the storage facility. They stood outside the building entrance for several minutes. They didn't knock, they didn't try to enter, they just stood there, looking around. Then, before leaving, they turned toward the camera and stared literally directly into it. There was something about that moment that really bothered me more than anything else, too. It was like they knew exactly where the camera was and wanted me to know that they had been there. I contacted my landlord and showed them the footage. They told me that they hadn't seen the person before and suggested that I contact the police if it happened again. Thankfully, nothing else happened after that. No more visits, no more marks on the window, but I stopped leaving the blinds open for sure after that. A week later, I actually got a new job, and the pay wasn't worth the constant feeling of looking over my shoulder every time that I walked outside in the old job anymore, so I took it. I still don't know how that person found my apartment. I mean, I never gave them my name, and there was nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, connecting my workplace to where I lived. I still avoid sitting near uncovered windows at night when the lights inside are on. It sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud, I know, but there's just something about being clearly visible from the darkness outside that really bothers me now. People who hear the story usually tell me that I was probably just scared because I was alone or whatever. And maybe they're right, but they weren't there and they didn't see the way that he was watching us. It wasn't curiosity, and it felt like he was studying the situation. So, a few years ago, I worked overnight security at a small rehabilitation center in a rural part of northern Oregon. The building was surrounded by farmland and patches of forest, with only a few houses scattered along the roads nearby. The overnight shift was usually quiet. Most of the residents were asleep, and my job was mostly checking the doors, walking the halls, and making sure nothing unusual was going on. So one night in early winter, I was sitting at the front desk doing some paperwork when one of the exterior lights near the visitor parking area turned on all of a sudden. The facility has motion lights because animals would trigger them all the time. Deer, raccoons, and occasionally even some stray dogs would wander through the property. I barely paid attention because of this reason, too. Then the light shut off, and a few seconds later it came back on again. Then again, and at first I assumed it was an animal moving around out there, but after the fourth time, something just felt wrong about it. The light wasn't flickering randomly, it was turning on, staying on for a few seconds, then shutting off again. Which meant that whatever was outside was moving in and out of the sensor range. And it almost felt like they were trying to figure out where it activated. I stood up and looked through the front windows. That's when I saw someone standing near the edge of the parking lot. He wasn't near the road as well. He wasn't walking past. He was inside of the property. The first thing that I noticed, too, was that he looked completely out of place. He was wearing an old work jacket and muddy boots, like someone who had been outside for hours at this stage, but he wasn't dressed like someone who was just passing through at the same time. He was standing still, facing the building, facing me. The glass reflected some of the interior lights, so at first I thought that maybe I was seeing my own reflection mixed with the outside or something like that. But then he stepped closer. He was only a few feet away from the window now, and I froze when I saw the blade in his hand. He wasn't looking around the property. He wasn't trying to find an entrance. He wasn't acting confused. He was looking directly into the building, into the room where I was standing. And the part that bothered me the most was just how calm he seemed. His expression wasn't angry or panicked or anything. He just stared, almost like he was waiting to see what I would do. I grabbed the phone and stepped away from the window, and as soon as I moved, he moved too. Not quickly and not aggressively, but he simply turned and walked toward the employee entrance on the side of the building. The door required a staff keycard to get in. I then called out through the intercom asking him to leave the property, and he stopped. For a moment, I thought that maybe he was going to respond, but instead he walked right up to the door and placed his hand against the glass. He didn't seem to be trying to break in. I mean, he wasn't pounding on it or anything. He was just sort of standing there, looking at me inside. Then he reached toward the card reader and ran his fingers over it, almost like he thought that he could get in or something. That's when I realized that he wasn't lost. He was testing things. I called emergency services while keeping my distance. I stayed inside until I heard a vehicle approaching, but by the time that the officers arrived, the man was gone. They searched the area around the building and followed the tree line, but they didn't find anyone in the end. There were no vehicles nearby, no explanation for why he'd been there, and the facility increased security afterward, and eventually they added more lighting around the entrances too. Thankfully, I never did see him again, but even now, all these years later, I still think about that night whenever I notice someone standing outside a building after dark. And like I said, the creepiest part was that it was how comfortable he seemed. He wasn't desperate and he wasn't confused. He was just quietly figuring out what was around him and trying to make the most of the situation, I guess. And the worst part, I guess, was realizing that if I hadn't have looked up at exactly that right moment, well, I might never have even known that he was there at all. I've always believed that cities teach you to recognize patterns. You learn which cars belong on your street, which people are just walking home, and which ones are there for a reason. You don't have to know everyone personally, but after enough time in one place, you start noticing when something feels wrong. A few years ago, I was living in a rougher part of Baltimore. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood where you just walked around carelessly, but it also wasn't some lawless wasteland like people imagine too. Most of the residents knew each other there. People sat outside when the weather was decent, and everyone had a bit of a general idea of who belonged there. Anyway, I worked overnight stocking at a grocery store at the time, so I usually got home sometime after 1 in the morning. I had been taking the same route for months at this point, cutting behind a row of older apartment buildings to avoid the main road. It was faster, and normally I wouldn't even think twice about it. But one night in early spring, I noticed a car parked behind one of the buildings. It wasn't unusual for vehicles to be left there, but something about it immediately caught my attention. It was an older sedan with fogged-up windows, sitting with the engine running but the lights off. I slowed down as I passed it, and a man stepped outside of the driver's side. He looked like he was in his 50s, maybe older, but what stood out was how clean and put together he looked compared to the area around him. He was wearing a neat jacket and expensive-looking shoes that didn't match the cracked pavement, graffiti-covered walls, and overflowing trash bins nearby. At first, I assumed he was just somebody visiting a resident. Then he started walking directly toward me. He didn't call out, and he didn't ask for directions or anything. He just approached. I moved to the side to give him some space, but he matched my movement and blocked my path. "Hey, can I help you?" I asked. He stared at me for a few seconds before saying, "You live around here." The question itself wasn't strange. It was the way that he asked it. It wasn't casual. It felt like he was trying to confirm something. I told him that I was heading home and stepped around him. That's when he grabbed the strap of my backpack. Not hard enough to throw me off balance, but enough to certainly stop me. My entire body went alert. I turned around and told him to let go. He didn't immediately respond. He looked past me toward the street like he was checking whether anybody else was around. Then I heard a car door open, and 2 more people getting out of the sedan. That was the moment that I understood that this wasn't some random interaction. They had been waiting for me. I started pulling away, and the man holding my backpack tightened his grip. One of the other guys moved closer, and I noticed that he kept one hand inside of his hoodie pocket. I didn't know if he had a weapon, but I certainly didn't want to find out. Then a window above us slammed open. "Hey!" The shout came from the 3rd floor of the building next to us. I looked up and saw an older man leaning out. I recognized him immediately. His name was Tony, and he had lived in that building for years. He was the kind of person who always knew what was happening on the block because he spent most evenings sitting near his window. He wasn't yelling for help or anything. He was yelling like he already knew exactly what was going on. "You 3 idiots want to explain why you're bothering people on my street?" The man holding my backpack looked up. Tony immediately started making noise, turning lights on, banging on the window frame, shouting that he had already called the police and that they had their car information. Whether he actually had or not, I didn't know, but it certainly changed the situation. The 3 men looked at each other. The guy holding me finally let go, and before getting back into the car, he looked at me again and said, "You got lucky." Then they drove away. I stood there for a while afterward, just trying to calm myself down a bit. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped my keys twice before I could get inside. The next day, Tony told me that he had noticed that same car parked around the area several nights in a row, and he said that he had been watching because he thought that something was off. He didn't know exactly what they were doing, but he had a feeling that they were looking for someone who was alone. I thanked Tony for looking out for me, and he said no problem. I moved away from that neighborhood later that year, in fact, but I still think about that night sometimes. I often wonder exactly what would have happened to me if Tony wasn't there at that exact time. I used to think that living several floors above the street gave you a certain amount of privacy. You're sort of removed from everything happening below. You don't hear every car door, every conversation, every person walking past your building. At least, that's what I thought. A few years ago, I was renting a small apartment on the 9th floor of an older building in Portland, Oregon. It was one of those buildings that had been renovated but still had a lot of its original features. The hallways were pretty narrow, the pipes were certainly old, and you could hear the elevator cables moving through the walls at night too. The area was pretty quiet though. Not completely empty, but the kind of neighborhood where people mostly kept to themselves. I never really felt unsafe there. I worked remotely at the time too, and I had gotten into the habit of staying up late to finish projects. Most nights I'd be sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop till around midnight or 1 in the morning, while the rest of the building was asleep. But one night I started hearing a strange noise though. At first I ignored it. Older buildings make noises constantly, right? Pipes expand, vents rattle, neighbors move around, and you learn to sort of tune it out a bit. But this was different. It sounded like something lightly tapping against metal. Not random, but a pattern too. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 taps again. I followed the sound and realized that it was coming from the wall near the laundry room. There was a maintenance access panel there that connected to some of the building's utility spaces. I assumed that something was loose behind it, maybe a pipe or some kind of equipment, until I heard someone cough. Upon hearing that, I froze. It wasn't a sound coming from another apartment. It was way too close. I stood there for a few seconds trying to convince myself that I must have misunderstood what I had heard. Then a voice quietly said, "Is anyone there?" My stomach dropped. The voice wasn't loud, but I certainly heard it. And I immediately stepped away from the wall and turned off the kitchen light. I grabbed my phone but didn't call anyone yet. I just stood there in the darkness listening. A few seconds later, I heard movement behind the panel, something scraping. Then a small metallic sort of clicking sound. I backed toward my bedroom and locked the door at this point. I lived alone, and suddenly every little thing about the apartment that had always felt normal started feeling like a weakness. The thin walls, the shared hallways, the fact that I had no idea who had access to the building. I called the building's emergency number first instead of the police because I wasn't even sure what was actually happening. While I waited, I stayed completely silent. For almost 20 minutes, there was movement behind that wall. Occasionally I heard someone shifting around, and then, at one point, I heard what sounded like somebody whispering my name. That was the moment that I stopped trying to rationalize it too. The building manager, he arrived with another maintenance worker, and the police were contacted afterward. They checked the utility area, but they never found anyone in there, which really creeped me out. The police said that somebody may have been staying or using the maintenance space to move around unnoticed in, but, I heard those voices and that shifting around right up until the moment that they opened that door. And the fact that they said that nobody was in there, well, that makes it even worse to me. They never found anyone responsible, but the building changed the locks, added cameras, and blocked off several access points too. I had to stick around for another couple of months because my lease wasn't over yet, but the thing that still really bothers me is that I just don't know how long that this had been happening for. What I mean is that what I thought was normal building noises, well, maybe they weren't all along. Maybe I just never really noticed before and, well, only noticed at that moment. I still don't really talk about this because even saying it out loud makes me feel like I'm describing a fever dream rather than something that actually happened. But I was 15, living in a dense mid-sized town where the sidewalks were always cracked and the air always tasted like exhaust. It was late autumn, the kind of grey day that drains the colour out of everything, and I had just had a massive falling out with my two best friends. Some stupid high school level drama stuff, and I decided to storm off and walk home alone that day. I was cutting through the service alley behind the old textile plant, a shortcut that ran parallel to the main road. I hadn't been walking for more than a minute, I think, when I realized that someone was behind me. It was a kid, maybe 10 years old, wearing a coat that looked like it had been salvaged from a landfill, too big, sleeves dangling past his knuckles, all that. He wasn't walking like a normal kid, though. He was sort of shuffling, his head tilted at a really weird sort of bird-like angle. When I sped up, he matched my pace perfectly, not saying a word and just sort of staring at the back of my head. I then felt this immediate, oily sense of wrongness, like I'd just stepped into a room where the oxygen was being sucked out. I didn't even want to look at him, to be honest, but I did, and when our eyes met, he gave me this wide, toothy grin that didn't reach his eyes at all. I was 15, 6 feet tall, and perfectly capable of handling myself, but felt like I was standing in front of a predator all of a sudden. "You like secrets?" he asked. His voice wasn't high-pitched. It was flat, monotone, like a recording. I kept walking, trying to project. "Don't talk to me." But he stayed right on my shoulder. "I have something for you," he whispered, "under the floorboards." I stopped. I don't know why. Maybe I was curious, or maybe I was just so unnerved that I was paralyzed, but he gestured toward the rotting wooden entrance of the old loading bay. Against my better judgment, I followed him. The smell inside was horrific, damp earth and something metallic. He led me into the dark, though, back toward a corner where the floor had collapsed into the crawl space below. He pointed down. In the darkness, there was something moving. It was a tangled mess of something grey and twitching. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced that I was about to be jumped. "They don't like it when you leave," the boy said, his grin widening. I didn't wait to see what was in that pit. I turned and sprinted towards the light at the far end of the bay. I didn't care how it looked, too. I didn't care about being tough, I just needed to be out in the open. As I reached the alleyway, I heard a car engine roar to life, though. A heavy, beat-up, old-looking thing that had been parked out of sight. A man in the driver's seat glared at me as he peeled away, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He looked at me with such specific hatred that it felt like I was being branded. I started running for home after that. I was 3 blocks away, lungs burning. I sprinted the rest of the way, locked myself in my room, and I didn't leave the house for about 3 days after that. I never did tell my parents, and I never told my friends, but for years afterward, I would wake up in the middle of the night, quite often, after having nightmares of that day. I still don't know exactly what was happening, but the whole thing, it certainly felt a lot like a setup. I think that it's the quiet moments that really get you. You think that you're in total control of your space, your home, your porch, your routine, and then, in the blink of an eye, the space just stops being yours. I was living in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac in Ohio about a decade ago, just finishing up a degree at the time. My routine was pretty locked in. 2 o'clock in the morning, the house is dark, the only sound is the hum of the central air, and I used to keep the sliding glass door to the backyard cracked open just a few inches to let the night air in a little bit. It was a pretty safe neighborhood, the kind where you leave your bike on the lawn and don't worry about it too much. I was sitting in the living room, dark except for the glow of my tablet, when the motion sensor light on the back deck tripped. I figured that it must have been a stray cat or an animal of some kind. I didn't even look up until I heard the distinct clacking sound of the latch being tested. I looked toward the glass and saw a silhouette framed against the moonlight. A guy standing there, perfectly still, his hand pressed against the handle of the sliding door. He was trying to force it, but not quite yet. He was just feeling the tension of the lock first, steady and methodical. I didn't scream. I just stood up, my heart doing that weird fluttering thing in my throat, and walked toward the door. I flicked on the interior light, and he didn't even flinch. He stayed there, his face pressed right against the glass, eyes wide and unblinking. I left my wallet in there, he said. His voice was muffled, strange, like he was speaking through a thick blanket. I was 22, but in that second, I felt like a kid. I gripped the handle of the heavy kitchen chair and yelled, "There's nobody here but me, and I'm calling the cops." He didn't move. He just smiled, a slow, tight expression that didn't reach his eyes, and slowly pulled his hand away from the glass. He reached into his pocket, and for a split second, I was certain that he was pulling out a weapon. Instead, though, he pulled out a set of keys and just jingled them at me. "Just checking," he said. Then he turned, stepped off the deck, and disappeared into the tree line bordering our yard. I was so paralyzed by that interaction that I didn't even reach for my phone until the sound of his footsteps had completely faded. By the time that I dialed 911, I felt like a hysterical idiot too. The patrol car cruised by 20 minutes later, saw nothing, and just left. Thankfully, I didn't see this guy again, and nothing was taken, but for months I couldn't sleep. I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was still looking for a way in. You look back on things and often wonder if you were ever in real danger, or if you were just the focal point of some strange bored predator's game or something. It's the paperboy excuse, isn't it? It's the lie that's just plausible enough to make you feel crazy for being afraid, but you weren't crazy. You don't come up to somebody's porch like that, thinking that you forgot your wallet. You do it because you want to see if the door is locked, and because you want to see what happens if you catch someone off guard. And it stays with you, doesn't it? That feeling that, for a few seconds, you weren't a person to them. You were a target, and they were testing the distance. I was living in an old apartment block in rural Montana during a particularly brutal winter. I was 17 at the time, finishing up a late study session, and my mum had just asked me to dump the kitchen scraps before turning in. The air outside was so cold that it felt like it was freezing the moisture right out of my lungs. The dumpsters, they were tucked away at the very back of the lot, right where the property line dissolved into a dense, unlit thicket of jack pines. I was maybe 10 feet away when I heard that wet rustling sound again. Not a scavenging animal, but the sound of somebody shifting weight on metal. I reached for the lid, and as it swung back, the moonlight hit the interior. He wasn't huddled in the corner. He was standing, braced against the sides of the bin, looking straight up. He was holding a kitchen knife, the blade serrated and rusted, gripped so tight that his knuckles were white. He didn't jump out, he just watched me, his expression totally vacant, like he was waiting for the right signal. My brain completely short-circuited. I couldn't scream, I couldn't even drop the bag. I just sort of stood there, paralyzed by the sight of that blade catching the pale moonlight. Just as he started to lift himself out, moving with a slow, deliberate intensity that was far scarier than if he had been frantic, a neighbor, Mr. Henderson, rounded the corner of the building walking his golden retriever. He was humming some old song, completely oblivious. The guy in the dumpster froze. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was tracking Mr. Henderson's progress. The moment that the neighbor stepped into the light of the parking lot, the guy in the bin let out a low, almost satisfied exhale. He didn't even look at me as he vaulted out of the bin. He just hit the ground and bolted into the pines, silent as a shadow. Mr. Henderson stopped, looked at me, and asked if I was okay. I couldn't get a word out. I just pointed at the dumpster. We never found him too. The police said that someone had been breaking into the storage units in the basement, but they never connected it to the guy in the bin. But that's the part that keeps me up at night. He didn't look like he was hiding from me. He looked like he was waiting for someone else to walk by, someone that he could corner, someone who wouldn't see him until it was too late. And I think about that knife. I think about how he seemed almost disappointed that the moment was ruined by a passerby. Sometimes, too, I wonder if he ever found that moment that he was waiting for. It's the silent, transactional nature of the train that makes it so unsettling, I think. I mean, you assume that because everyone has a ticket, everyone has a destination, and therefore everyone is playing by the same rules. But sometimes you run into someone who isn't interested in the ride. They're just interested in the proximity. So, I was riding the late night line a few years back, heading home from a long shift. The carriage was mostly empty, save for a few exhausted commuters and one man slumped against the glass near the sliding doors. He was clearly intoxicated, the kind of twitchy, erratic drunkenness that makes people give a wide berth. He had his eyes fixed on a woman sitting 2 rows up from me, and it wasn't just a glare, it was a fixated stare. Every time the train rocked, he'd shift as well, and every time that he shifted, he seemed to be calculating the distance between them almost. The woman was visibly struggling to keep her composure, clutching her handbag, refusing to look up. I stood up, pretending to reach for the overhead strap and moved into the aisle. I positioned myself directly between them, effectively killing the line of sight. As I shifted my bag to make it look like a casual adjustment, I caught a glimpse of his right hand, which had been buried deep in the pocket of his oversized jacket, and he pulled it out, and for a fleeting second, the overhead light caught something jagged and metallic. It wasn't a standard knife, it was a shiv, a jagged, rusted piece of sharpened rebar wrapped in electrical tape. He didn't brandish it, he just held it against his thigh, his thumb running over the uneven edge of the metal. My heart felt like it skipped 3 beats upon seeing it. I didn't say a word. I just stared back at him, my expression deadpan, my hand hovering near the pocket where I kept my heavy keys. I wanted him to know that I had seen the weapon, and that if he made a move with it, he wasn't going to be dealing with the girl, he was going to be dealing with me instead. The train slowed for the next station. He didn't blink. He just held that gaze for 10 seconds, an eternity in a subway car, before letting out a short, wet laugh, and he slid the rebar back into his jacket, stood up and stepped out onto the platform just as the doors were closing. I stayed on the train until the end of the line, even though it was 3 stops past my own. The girl, she got off shortly after he did, clearly unaware of what had been hidden in the pocket just feet away from her. And, well, you think about the what-ifs for days after when you experience something like this. What if I hadn't moved? What if he had decided that the weapon was more important than the intimidation? It's the sheer absurdity of it too. Somebody carrying a piece of scrap metal into a public transit system, waiting for the perfect moment to see how much fear they can harvest from a stranger like that. It's not just an annoyance, it's a terrifying reminder that some people aren't traveling at all. They're just hunting, and they're counting on the rest of us to be too polite or too oblivious to notice. I was 7, maybe 8 years old when this happened. We were at a massive science museum in the city. It was the one with the vaulted ceilings and the endless dark labyrinthine halls of the deep sea exhibit. I was obsessed with the jellyfish tanks at the time, and my parents were arguing about parking or lunch, totally distracted, so I sort of drifted for a bit. The room was dim, lit only by the shifting blue glow of the tanks. I was mesmerized by a display of glowing eels when I noticed a guy standing in the shadows of the adjacent wall. He was older, maybe mid-40s, wearing one of those generic grey polo shirts that could have been staff, but something about him was just off. He wasn't watching the fish, he was watching me. He didn't make a move until I turned to leave. Then he stepped out, blocking the narrow path between the tanks. He crouched down, not to my eye level, but just low enough to seem sort of non-threatening. He had this weird, tight smile, like he was trying to practice being a normal human and failing. "Hey," he whispered, gesturing toward a heavy steel maintenance door that was slightly ajar behind him. "You like the glowing stuff? There's a hatch back there. If you look through the glass, you can see how they keep the squids. It's rare. Nobody else gets to see it. Want to come and take a look?" I remember the smell of him. It wasn't the sterile, air-conditioned scent of the museum. He stank like cigarettes and BO, and it was just wrong to me at the time. My gut didn't just feel like something was off. It was screaming at me to run. I didn't even say no. I just turned and bolted toward the main atrium where the T-Rex skeleton was. I didn't look back until I reached my dad's leg, gasping for air. My dad immediately asked what was wrong, and I pointed back at the hall and went to go and check, but of course the guy was gone. A museum guard told us later that no staff were working that exhibit at that hour, and there weren't any feedings behind that door at all. It was just a storage closet. I'm 30 now, and I still can't stand windowless dim rooms. People ask why I'm so paranoid about stranger danger as well, and they just don't get that it's not about fear of the dark. It's the memory of someone who knew how to act like a person in charge, trying to lead a child into a closet because he knew that they'd follow the promise of something shiny. It was a lure, plain and simple, and he was just waiting for the right kid to take the bait. I've lived in this building for 22 years, ever since my mother and I moved into the upper floors of this old brick townhouse. It's in one of those older sort of residential streets, and the place was renovated before we even bought it, with modern plumbing, new electrical wiring, and polished hardwood floors. But the original structure, it was still there underneath it all. The walls were pretty thick, the staircase narrow, and there was always this faint smell of old wood, dust, and something darker that seemed trapped beneath the layers of paint. For as long as I can remember, the activity here hasn't felt like a traditional haunting. There are no apparitions drifting through the hallways or voices calling from empty rooms or anything like that. It's always been physical or tangible, like something unseen was constantly trying to interact with the weight and the structure of the house. It became unbearable too when I was around 13. That was when the hallway started feeling wrong. It's hard to explain, but it was like the air itself felt sort of compressed. Walking from one room to another felt like moving through a space that was resisting you almost. It all started with the doors, in fact. Not random movements and not occasional creaks, but almost like testing. Every night, the latches throughout the house, they would begin clicking one after another. It would always start at the back door near the kitchen, moving to the hallway closet, and finally reach my bedroom door. The sound always followed the same pattern too, like something was slowly learning how each lock worked. The kitchen has always been the center of it though, and last Tuesday, my mother was standing at the counter making some tea. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of traffic outside, like always. She was completely calm, not thinking about anything unusual, when the tall pantry door beside her suddenly just swung open. Not slowly as well, but violently. It slammed against its hinges like something had thrown its entire weight into it from the inside. She froze. Then, every ceramic mug sitting on the drying rack began vibrating like crazy. Not shaking too, but vibrating. The mugs blurred slightly as they trembled against the counter. Then, one by one, they started sliding toward the edge. But they didn't fall. Each one stopped exactly within an inch from the drop. My mother stood there for several seconds, staring at them. Then she walked out of the kitchen, and she didn't turn around. That became our rule years ago. If something happens, you just leave the room. You don't challenge it, you don't ask questions, you don't give it your attention. But the strangest part is that it doesn't seem attached to the house. It sort of follows us, really. Like 3 years ago, I stayed with a friend at her family's cabin in the Appalachian Mountains. It was a newer building, only about 15 years old, surrounded by forest. There was nothing old about the place, nothing that should have had history anyway. Then around 2 a.m, I woke up to the strangest sound. The wooden bedside table beside my bed was moving. Not sliding and not falling, but it was sort of lifting slightly off the floor and dropping back down in a slow, deliberate way, like something underneath it was testing how much force it needed to move an object. I looked across the room and saw my friend already awake. She was staring at it, not scared, but just sort of exhausted, like she had seen it before maybe. That was when I realized that whatever this was had been happening around other people too. It isn't always aggressive. Sometimes it almost feels curious, in fact, like something that exists beside our reality but doesn't fully understand the rules, maybe. We've tried everything too. We've had the house blessed, we've rearranged furniture, we've ignored it, we've yelled at empty rooms, but nothing changes. The activity, it always returns. Last night I found the strangest sign yet, too. I had been sitting on the living room sofa, reading, when I got up to make a coffee, and as I walked past the wooden coffee table, I noticed the layer of dust covering the surface, and something had disturbed it. There were like dozens of tiny marks pressed into the dust, perfectly spaced, and not random. They formed a sort of spiral pattern that started near the edge of the table and slowly worked inward toward the center, like something had been carefully placing invisible fingerprints onto the surface. Again, perhaps trying to understand the texture. I have a bit of a theory too, but I never say it out loud because, well, saying it makes it feel more real, I guess. My theory is that I don't think that this is a ghost. I don't think it's a spirit trapped in the house. I think it's something else entirely. I think it's something like a fracture in the normal structure of reality, a place where the rules are slightly damaged and whatever exists on the other side is slowly learning how our world works by watching us. It isn't haunting the house, it's studying it, studying us. Today, It's been quiet too, a little too quiet for me in fact. The air feels strangely clear, almost sharp, like the house is holding its breath. My mother went out to run some errands about an hour ago, and I'm sitting alone in the living room staring at the pantry door. And look, I know how ridiculous that sounds. I know how irrational it really is, but I swear that I can feel it. The moment that she left, the house just changed. The floorboards, they stopped creaking. The walls stopped settling, and everything just sort of became really still, like something was waiting. Waiting for humans to leave, maybe, so that it could start moving again. I'm not leaving this room until she gets back, though, because after 22 years of living here, I've learned one thing for sure. Whatever is in this house, it doesn't make noise when you're watching. Instead, it makes noise when it knows that we've stopped paying attention. My oldest daughter, Maya, was 12 when this happened. She's autistic, and one thing about her always stood out. She is brutally precise. She doesn't exaggerate, she doesn't embellish, and she has no patience for statements that aren't technically true. Like, if you tell her that you'll be there in a minute, she will remember the exact time and correct you if it takes longer. She sees facts as a fixed point rather than a suggestion. And that's why what she told me that afternoon, it still bothers me. It was a Tuesday in late summer, one of those heavy overcast days where the humidity settles into the brick walls. I was sitting at the kitchen island, sorting through paperwork, when I heard some footsteps pounding down the hallway. Maya appeared around the corner, looking like she had just escaped something. Her face had gone completely pale, not just scared, but drained. Her breathing was uneven, almost mechanical, and she grabbed my arm so hard that I could feel her fingers digging into my skin. "There's another Lily in my room," she said. At first, I thought that she meant her younger sister had followed her upstairs. "Maya, Lily's right there," I said, pointing toward the living room. My 7-year-old daughter was sitting exactly where she had been for the past hour, curled up under a blanket watching cartoons. Her feet were tapping along with the music, completely unaware of anything happening around her at that moment. Maya shook her head. "No, that's why it's wrong." Her voice stayed strangely calm at this point, but her hands were trembling. "I went to get my drawing pad from underneath my bed. She was in the corner." I stopped sorting papers. "What do you mean that she was in the corner?" "She was crouching down, facing the wall." Maya swallowed. Her back was bent the wrong way, like she was folded. I felt the first wave of fear hit me, the kind that arrives before your brain has a chance to explain it away. "Maya, what did she look like?" She stared at me for several seconds. "She looked like Lily from far away." That sentence bothered me more than anything else, too. From far away? Maya nodded. But when I got closer, she wasn't Lily. She looked toward the living room, where her sister was still laughing at the television. She didn't move, she didn't blink, she didn't breathe even. I walked down the hallway toward Maya's room with a baseball bat that I kept in the closet. I felt ridiculous carrying it, but I just couldn't make myself leave it behind. The room, though, was empty. The bed was untouched, the closet was open, the space beneath the bed contained nothing except for some dust, an old sock, and a few forgotten toys. There was no hidden person, no explanation, and nothing that made sense. But I did notice something. Maya's room felt suddenly wrong. And not in a way that I can really explain, but just wrong. The closest way that I can explain it is like the room had been copied from a memory of itself, and something had made tiny mistakes while recreating it. I know that sounds weird, but that's just how it felt. Anyway, I went back to the living room and watched Lily for several minutes. She was exactly as she always was, loud, energetic, constantly moving. She was laughing at something on the screen and kicking her feet under the blanket. I finally asked, "Hey, did you go into Maya's room today at all?" She barely looked away from the television. No, why would I? Her room is boring. It was such a normal answer that it almost made me feel better. Almost. Because Maya believed her. She knew Lily's habits better than anyone, really. She knew when her sister was lying, too, and when she was joking and when she was trying to get attention, and this wasn't a misunderstanding to her. This was something that didn't fit into any category that she understood. Maya refused to sleep in her room after that, too. For almost a month, she stayed in the guest room. Eventually, we moved her things there permanently as well, but something about the loft changed after that day. Nothing obvious happened, like no objects moving, no strange sounds or dramatic events or anything, but it was always just different. Everything looked the same, but the feeling behind it was gone. The shadows seemed a bit deeper, the corners seemed darker, the rooms felt like they were waiting for something, and I've heard people call things like this mimics, but I don't like that word. It sounds too fictional and too convenient. It makes something impossible feel like it belongs in a movie almost. And even now, when I'm working late and the loft is quiet, I sometimes catch Maya standing in the doorway of her new room, staring back toward that hallway. She never talks about what happened anymore. That's just how Maya is. If something has no logical solution, she eventually files it away and just moves on, but I have noticed something. Before she walks into a room now, she always checks the corners first. Not quickly and not nervously, but carefully, like she's looking for something that she hopes that she never finds again. I was 17 when I first realized that there was something really wrong with the stretch of land behind my grandparents' house in the Northern Highlands. It was 2013 and I was spending part of the summer there with my younger brother. The village itself was barely a village anymore, just a handful of stone houses scattered across a landscape of black peat, windswept grass and hills that seemed to disappear into the constant grey mist. The place, though, it had a strange effect on people. During the day, it was absolutely beautiful. The hills rolled endlessly, the lochs reflected the sky, and the silence felt peaceful. But once the weather shifted and the sun started dropping, that same silence became something else. It felt less like being alone and more like being somewhere that was quietly paying attention. My brother was 14 at the time and usually fearless. He was the type of kid who would climb cliffs, explore abandoned buildings, and laugh at anyone who warned him to be careful. That's why what happened one evening still bothers me so much. He wasn't the kind of person who really scared easily. We were riding our bikes back from a small stream a few miles from the house when the weather started turning. The wind had picked up and the clouds were rolling in over the hills, and I was behind him when I heard his brakes lock. The back tire of his bike slid sideways across the gravel, and he hit the ground hard enough that I thought that he had broken something. I quickly jumped off my bike and ran toward him. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer. He was sitting on the ground, staring past me toward an old cottage, sitting alone near the edge of the moor. The building, it had been abandoned for years. The windows were covered, the garden had disappeared under weeds long ago, and the roof was starting to collapse in places too. But he wasn't looking at the house. He was looking directly at the porch. Did you see that?" he whispered. I turned around. At first, there was nothing, just a sagging wooden porch, a broken chair, and darkness behind the boarded windows. But then, I can't explain it properly, but it was like looking through a layer of distorted glass. The space around the doorway seemed to bend slightly, almost like the world was struggling to keep its shape. And then something appeared. It looked like a woman, but only from a distance. The closer that I looked, the less human it became too. It was covered in old, soaked fabric that hung from its body like funeral clothing left out in the rain. Its movements were really unnatural. It didn't walk toward us. It appeared in one place and then just appeared in another, like individual moments were being stitched together incorrectly. I heard something then. Not a voice, not exactly. It was more of a sensation inside of my head, like words being pushed into my mind. Come closer. The house is warm. You're hurt. You need shelter. The terrifying part was that some part of me wanted to listen to this. I felt my feet shift forward before I even realized that I was moving. My mind was telling me to run, but my body felt like it had forgotten whose side it was on. Then my brother grabbed the back of my jacket hard. His fingers dug into my shoulder, and the sudden pain snapped me out of whatever that was. The moment that I blinked, the porch was empty. The cottage was exactly as it had been before, silent, locked, and dead. We got out of there, and we didn't speak about it while we rode home. We didn't even look back, in fact. We just kept going until we reached my grandparents' house, slammed the door behind us, and locked every door that we could. A few weeks later, something similar happened near the woods beside the lock, too. My brother had gone exploring with his friend Jamie, while I stayed closer to the path with my bike. The forest wasn't dense in this part. It was mostly thin trees and open ground. You could see through it easily, in fact. And that's what made what happened so strange, I think. They were gone for maybe 15 minutes before I saw them come back. They weren't running. They looked worse than that, in fact. They were moving frantically like they had just escaped something. Jamie was holding onto my brother's arm, practically dragging him toward me, both of them looking pale. And when we got back to the house, I asked what happened. At first, neither of them wanted to answer me, but eventually Jamie told me that they had heard something. He described it as a deep, heavy sound that seemed to come from underneath the ground, like some sort of an enormous machine was operating far below them. Then he said that the strangest thing happened. The trees stopped. I thought that he meant that they had stopped moving, but that wasn't what he meant. The wind was still blowing, he said. The branches were moving, but the sound disappeared and everything went silent except for that sound. He said that they could feel it more than hear it, like it was happening inside of their bodies and mind. Then, according to him, they heard a single sound. A bell. One enormous metallic strike from somewhere beneath the forest floor. And after that, they ran. Neither of them ever went back there, and I stopped exploring that part of the countryside too. Even years later, whenever I'm somewhere completely quiet, I notice myself listening for that same sound as well. Like something buried deep below the earth is still trying to remind us that it knows that we're there. I don't believe that every strange thing has a reason to it. Some places just feel wrong, and sometimes the safest thing that you can do is accept that you don't need to understand what's watching you and, well, just get out of there. I was 21 when I moved into that apartment block. It was on the outskirts of the town that I was living nearby. It was the kind of building that you could find anywhere across the region. Mass-produced concrete, narrow stairwells, identical doors, and hallways that always smelled faintly of dust and old paint and overheated wiring. The four of us, though, we shared the apartment while we were studying. None of us knew each other before moving in, and we were from different places, different families, and had completely different personalities too. In fact, the only thing that we had in common was that we were young, broke, and willing to tolerate a depressing building if it meant having somewhere affordable to live. Anyway, for the first several months, I assumed that something was wrong with me. You see, I started noticing a woman. Not clearly, though, never clearly, in fact. She was always there for less than a second, appearing somewhere just outside of my direct line of sight. A flash of bright orange-red hair against the washed-out grey of the apartment. A shape moving quickly at the end of the hallway. A glimpse of pale skin covered in thin, dark markings that looked almost like scratches or cracks, but not quite. Every time that I turned to look, though, nothing was ever there. At first, I sort of mentioned it casually, too. I told my roommates that I thought that I was seeing things because of exhaustion. I was spending long nights studying under harsh fluorescent lights after all, drinking way too much coffee, and sleeping badly to boot. It made sense that my eyes or my brain might be filling in details that weren't there after all. But the problem was that the image just never changed. It was always the same. The same impossible color of hair, the same hurried movement, the same strange pattern across her skin. And after a while, I just sort of stopped talking about it. I mean, the idea that I was hallucinating was unsettling enough for me, and the idea that I was describing some reoccurring figure that nobody else could see sounded even worse. So I convinced myself that it was stress. But then, one evening, everything changed. The four of us were sitting in the kitchen drinking some tea when someone brought up stories about strange things that people had experienced in old apartment buildings. It was mostly joking around, typical late-night conversations where everyone tries to sort of scare each other. Someone mentioned seeing figures in the corner of their eye, and I don't know why I said anything. Maybe I was tired of keeping it to myself. I don't know, but I then said, "I've seen something here. A woman. She has red hair, and she moves really fast, and there are marks on her face." The conversation stopped instantly. Not gradually, but instantly. Everyone looked at me too. Not with confusion, though, but with a sort of recognition. One of my roommates, Victor, slowly put his cup down. "She runs, doesn't she?" he asked. I felt my stomach drop. "What?" "She never walks," he said quietly. "She's always moving like she's late for something." Before I could answer, Anna spoke from across the table. "I saw her in the hallway mirror once." Her voice was now barely above a whisper. "I thought that I was getting sick. I saw her behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing." The room went silent again. Then we started comparing details. And it turns out that every single one of us had actually seen her. None of us had described her to anybody else, mind you. We had all assumed that we were the only person experiencing it. The details were almost identical, though. The flashes of orange hair, the unnatural speed, the feeling that she wasn't walking through the building so much as appearing in different places inside of it. We searched for explanations, too. We looked through the old building information. We searched local stories and records. We expected to find something. A fire, an incident, a missing person. Anything that could explain why this image kept appearing, but there was nothing. No tragic history, no obvious reason. And that somehow made it all the more worse, really. I mean, a ghost is frightening because there is usually a story attached to it, right? A person, a place, or something that happened, but this felt different. After that, though, the apartment changed. Not physically, I mean, nothing moved and nothing broke or anything, but the feeling of normality just completely disappeared. The building no longer felt like a place where we lived. It instead felt like a place where something was constantly being repeated, like we were walking through a system that occasionally malfunctioned. I eventually moved away too. I live in another city now, far from that apartment block, but the sightings, they never completely stopped. It happens rarely, and I'll be waiting somewhere, reading or walking through a crowded street, and suddenly I'll get that same strange sensation. A pause, a flicker, a feeling like reality skipped for half a second, and then I turn my head quickly enough and I'll catch it. A streak of red-orange hair, a shape moving quickly, those strange markings and that same urgent, hurried posture. I don't think that she's a ghost, though. A ghost implies that there was a person who once belonged somewhere. Whatever I saw, it never felt like someone who had lived and died. And I know that this is going to sound weird, but it felt more like something that had been sort of trapped, really. Sometimes I wonder if she isn't a warning. I mean, maybe humans have an instinct for recognizing when something around them is wrong. Or maybe our brains create symbols for things that we cannot understand. Or maybe she is exactly what she appears to be. a flaw in the world that occasionally becomes visible. Either way, I try desperately not to look anymore. When that familiar feeling arrives, I try to keep my eyes forward now. Because if something is only there when you notice it, well, maybe the safest thing to do is to just pretend that you never saw it at all. I don't usually tell this story because I honestly don't know what I believe happened. I've gone back and forth between convincing myself that it was exhaustion, grief, stress, or simply my imagination filling in the gaps. But even now, years later, I still don't really have an answer that completely satisfies me. This happened in late 2020. After my grandmother passed away, I spent several weeks helping my aunt take care of her property in a small mountain community. It wasn't an isolated cabin or anything like that, but the neighborhood sat high above the valley where the evenings became incredibly quiet once the sun disappeared. At night, you could hear almost nothing up there. No traffic and no people, just the wind moving through the pine trees and the occasional barking dog somewhere in the distance. The house itself felt strangely empty after my grandmother was gone. She had been the kind of person who naturally held everyone together, really. Family gatherings always happened around her, and somehow she could calm an argument without raising her voice. Losing her didn't feel dramatic at first, but instead it sort of settled over the house little by little, I think. Every room seemed quieter than it should have been. I stayed in what had once been her sewing room, in fact. Most of her belongings had already been packed away, but the room smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, just like her. Every night I slept on an old fold-out bed beside a large window that overlooked the front yard and the road beyond it. And for the first couple of weeks, I barely slept. I kept waking sometime before dawn with a racing heart, and it wasn't because I thought somebody was inside the house or anything. It was just this overwhelming feeling that something important had been left unfinished. I'd sit awake for an hour or more before finally drifting back to sleep as well. And then one morning, something happened that I still replay in my head. I woke unusually early. The sky wasn't dark anymore, but the sun hadn't quite come up either yet. Everything outside had that sort of dull grey-blue color to it that only lasts a few minutes before sunrise. Something made me look out the window, though, and standing beside the old wooden gate near the road was someone dressed entirely in pale clothing. At first, I assumed it was one of the neighbors, but the longer I looked, the less sense it made. The figure wasn't moving, not even slightly. The wind was blowing hard enough to shake the tree branches, yet the person's clothing didn't move at all. I couldn't make out a face. Their head was angled downward as though they were looking at the ground, and I remember waiting for them to sort of take a step, but they never did. I watched for what felt like half a minute, I would say, and then I hurried out of the room to wake my aunt. I didn't want to go outside by myself, and so I told her that somebody was standing at the front gate. She grabbed a flashlight, even though the daylight was beginning to appear, and we both walked back toward the window, but the yard was empty. The road was empty. There wasn't anyone nearby. We even stepped outside and checked around the fence, expecting whoever I'd seen to still be close, but there was nobody there. My aunt suggested that I had probably just seen a neighbor walking home early or something like that. Honestly, too, I wanted to believe that, but I knew that the person hadn't been walking. They hadn't moved at all, in fact. For the rest of my stay, I found myself looking toward the gate every morning without meaning to as well. I never saw the figure again, but over the years I've spent a lot of time trying to explain what that was. Maybe grief altered the way that I perceived things. Entirely possible, I suppose. Maybe waking suddenly during that strange hour before sunrise caused my brain to misinterpret shadows and changing light. Both explanations seem reasonable for sure, but neither fully explains why the image had remained so vivid all these years. What unsettles me the most, too, isn't the possibility that I saw a ghost or anything. It's that the figure didn't feel supernatural at all. In fact, it felt familiar almost. Almost as though my mind had briefly created someone to occupy the space that my grandmother had left behind. When someone is central to your life like that for so many years, I guess your brain becomes used to their presence. Maybe after they're gone, part of you keeps expecting to find them somewhere. Maybe that's what was happening that morning. Maybe my mind simply placed a silent figure where it expected someone to be. Or maybe there are moments during grief where reality becomes a little less reliable than we like to believe or something. I honestly don't know, and all I do know is that, well, I think that I saw someone who just disappeared into thin air. When I, a 38-year-old male, was 18, I lived in a suburb of southeast Melbourne, Australia, Noble Park. Our house, it was the odd one out. On a street of 70s to 80s brick homes, ours was an Alpine-style weatherboard home with a steep roof built in the early 20th century. It was old, cold, and noisy, and you could see the ground through the gaps in the floorboards even. We had a big dog who stayed outside until everyone was home, and then slept outside in a big pen or doghouse at night, mostly in the summer. We also had an indoor cat. The week that this happened, I was home alone and Dad was overseas. Mum and Sis were visiting family. So one night, when walking home from work, I rounded the corner and noticed a figure standing on our carport roof, looking through a window into one of the 3 upstairs bedrooms. The sun was setting, so all I could see was a dark silhouette. I yelled at it from the top of the driveway, and then it was just gone. I remember thinking that that was odd, that my dog didn't bark or notice anything. I went inside and checked the house, the dog, the windows, and the doors, etc. Everything seemed to be in place. I assumed I had just seen a shadow from a nearby tree at sunset or something. The following night, I walked home from work, and everything seemed normal. I checked all the windows and the doors, let the dog inside for the evening, and eventually put him and myself to bed. Now, my bedroom was upstairs, down the hall from the room next to the carport roof. But before bed, I had a routine of shutting all the doors in the house, as they were all sort of squeaky and the drafts would often blow them closed if left open. This night, I closed all the doors, checked the locks, turned off all the lights, and eventually I went to sleep. In the middle of the night, though, I was awoken by something. I'm not sure what, but when I came to, I focused my eyes and looked around. I saw the hallway light coming in under my room, and I thought that I had turned that off, but perhaps I had forgotten. Right then, my doorknob started rattling, though, like somebody was struggling to open it. I immediately lay back down on my side, facing the wall opposite my bed, and my heart starts beating hard. I hear the door open, and so I close my eyes. I figured that if someone was breaking in, that my best chance was to pretend that I was asleep and maybe they'll take what they want and just leave. I slowly open one eye, the one against the pillow so it's less obvious. I see the light from the hallway on my wall. My bedroom door is fully open. My heart is beating harder now, and I lay still. I see the digital clock on my CD player, and a little after 2 a.m. Then I hear the door creak again and watch as the light on the wall slowly starts to disappear. The bedroom door is closing, and at this point I'm positive we're being robbed, but I continue to pretend that I'm asleep. Keeping one eye open, everything is heightened. The loudest noise is my heartbeat, but I try to listen through it and I can't hear anything. No breathing, no footsteps, nothing. At this point, I begin to feel pressure around both my feet. The blanket is getting tighter around them, and it was then that I realized that something or someone is now sitting at the end of my bed. I look at the clock again, and it's now a little before 3 a.m. I'm frozen, scared, and have no idea what's happening. At some point, I have the idea to slowly readjust my position in bed and move my feet a little to see if something or someone moves or something happens. So I do this, but as I slowly readjust my feet, I feel one of them hit something solid. Something is definitely sitting on the end of my bed. I don't know what to do at this point, so I just stay still and listen while looking through one eye at the clock on the bedroom wall. The next thing that I remember, though, is hearing the first bird starting to chirp before sunrise. I look at the clock and it's now a little before 6 a.m, and I notice that the room is a little brighter. The sun is coming up. Shortly after this, I feel the pressure lift from the end of the bed. I hear the bedroom door open. I see the light from the hallway on the wall again, and then the door shuts and the sun starts to rise. I got up shortly after this, freaked out, and checked the whole house. All the doors and the windows were locked. The dog had slept through the night and nothing from the house was missing. Weirdly though, my cat was stuck in the bathroom overnight. He must have followed me when I brushed my teeth without me noticing and must have got locked in there or something. To this day, I'm really not sure what happened that night, but I sure as heck will never forget that night in Noble Park. So I'm from a not wealthy, you could say, third world country. It's not as bad as it seems, but not as developed as it should be, really. Several times a year I visited my grandparents in the countryside. They had several cows, sheep, chickens, etc. Regular stuff. My uncle, who was 6 years older than me, used to work as a shepherd, in fact. He was about 13 back then, and so he invited me to look after sheep with him sometimes, and I took this opportunity as a bit of an adventure. Now, imagine a green place surrounded by mountains, beautiful scenery. It was almost nighttime, and we put the sheep in circle fencing, made a bonfire and prepared to eat bread, jerky meat and yogurt, and we started talking. You know when you are young and in an open space at night you talk about scary stuff? Well, suddenly, another shepherd who was an elderly person joined us out of nowhere. We didn't mind, especially after finding out that he had sausages and many other delicious things with him. Surrounded by a bonfire in fresh air with stars as visible as the palm of your hand, it was very picturesque, when suddenly this elderly person asked if we believe in the shaitan or the devil. I said yes, and my uncle said no. He then proceeded to say, about 2 months ago, I was herding my sheep. Usually when you herd them, there are always goats in the front. They are like the leaders of the sheep, really. They eat better grass, drink cleaner water, etc. He was explaining. My uncle then said, those are obvious things, so what are you talking about? But he then said, one goat was acting kind of weird, behind the sheep, never joined the other goats and ignored any commands. Funny thing is, my dog and horse were acting as if the goat was a snake. They didn't come near it and tried to avoid it, so I got off my horse, looked closer at the goat, and realized the goat wasn't from my herd. I said what the heck to this and tried to find any labels on it. Amazingly, this goat was white as snow and didn't have any labels or marks. Usually sheep and goats have labels on their ears like earrings sort of thing. But when I tried to look even closer to it, it actually bit me. After that, I got pretty angry and kicked it, and suddenly sort of lost consciousness. Everything was sort of blurry, but I swear to you that I saw the goat get up, shake itself off, and walk away on 2 legs. Nobody believed me, and it's kind of difficult for me to look after goats now because I'm sort of afraid of them. After his words, my uncle and I were a little bit shook. Like, I mean, what the heck, right? Why did you even tell us that story before nighttime? We didn't sleep well that night, and we never went too close to the goats of his flock either. But what do you think? Do you think that he was telling us the truth, or was he under some kind of influence? Was he just saying this to scare us? He seemed legitimate. He seemed like he believed his own story. I really don't know what to think about that guy and his story, but something about it just really had me shook. Throughout my childhood, I grew up in a pretty dark household, and I could recall several instances where, well, really no explanation could be derived. Here's a few. So the first one, we were watching a movie when a picture frame that had hung on the wall suddenly lifted and crashed to the floor. It had been there for years with no issues prior to this, so it was really strange. On another occasion, my older sister, 18 at the time, she was home from college, about to head to work. She talks to my mother from another room and tells her, "I love you, Mum, I'm going to work, bye." My mother replies, "I love you too, bye." And my sister begins driving down the street when she sees our mother driving past. My sister instantly hits the brakes. My mother recalls seeing a shocked expression and my sister's face ran pale. My sister says, "Weren't you at the house?" My mum was coming home from the store apparently though, and hadn't been home for at least 45 minutes. A third occasion, my little sister, 10, and I, 12, were home alone, too afraid to leave the family room due to having a weird creeped out feeling. My father comes home from shopping and asks us why we moved the cat tower from his room to the hallway, blocking the door that he was trying to get into. But I can assure you that we never left that room. No one in our family touched it at all, and I still have no idea how it got there. Another time, my father, sister, and I are in my parents' room working on homework and work and all that, when we hear the front door handle being messed with and hear the door open. My mother and sister were on their way home from my sister's dance class, so we yelled hello. Our dogs run to the door to greet them. We hear sort of frantic, loud footsteps all throughout the home suddenly, and even outside around the house. They never responded to us. We hear the footsteps approaching the door and stops at the bedroom door. Getting worried, my dad yells for my mother, and realizing that something was wrong, my father grabs a Glock from his safe. He then searches all throughout the house. When he leaves the room, the footsteps stop. My sister and mother text our group chat, and they tell us that they were on their way home now. In other words, there was no one else in the home. No door opening and closing, signifying a person exiting or anything, but something definitely entered. Finally, on another occasion, seeing my sister walk past me in the kitchen as I prepared my lunch for the next day, I ask her if she wants me to make her some as well. She doesn't respond as she enters the family room, and so confused, I walk after her. But she wasn't in the family room. I then enter her bedroom down the hall. I ask her why she ignored me just then, and she tells me that she hasn't left her room for over 20 minutes as she's doing homework. I instantly felt the blood draining from my face when she said that. Our home did have a dark history. I found a calendar shoved in the floorboards once from the 1930s, which mysteriously disappeared. Our home was apparently a meth lab in the early 2000s. The couple who lived there died in a police chase. Even our grandmother said that we would claim that there was a man watching us in our home bedroom, which she said creeped her out due to the fact that a man had died in her bedroom before they moved in. Unfortunately, she ended up passing away in that very spot too. It was early September in central Idaho, and fall had begun to paint the Lemmy mountain range in flecks of amber and crimson among the sea of pine forests. The air was crisp, carrying that chill that signaled the start of elk hunting season. To find the best herds in this area of Idaho, at this time of year, you have to climb high, really high. During the summer, elk favor the high elevation pine forests, where the vegetation is lusher and the temperatures cooler than the sagebrush valley below. As winter caps the ranges in blankets of snow, the elk slowly migrate to the valley floor. It's the animal's natural cycle and one predictable enough to help look for them during hunting season. Over Labor Day weekend, my closest two friends, Tyson and John, and I decided to take a week off work to hunt elk in the Lemmy Range. We'd been friends since childhood, but life had a way of pulling us apart. Families, careers, responsibilities. This trip was our chance to reconnect, to revisit the camaraderie that we'd always cherished. We loaded Tyson's truck and drove for over an hour northwest from Idaho Falls into the heart of Idaho's remote central mountains. We turned off the little two-lane highway, the one that snakes up the little Lost Valley, until we got to a familiar turnoff and headed up an old Forest Service road, FS 126. That little dusty road, no bigger than a dirt path, winds and curves through an unnamed canyon into the heart of the mountains. The Forest Service has long since let the road fall into disrepair, but we navigated a couple of washed-out sections at the base of the canyon, and once we were up beyond the tree line, the road was more solid. It was slow going through, though. The way was littered with fallen rocks and tangled tree limbs that continually blocked our path. After stopping every few minutes to clear the debris, John and I decided to hike ahead, removing obstacles while Tyson navigated the truck behind us. It was a long climb up the switchbacks to the top, but as we reached the ridgetop, the remnants of an old mining claim came into view. Cleared and flattened back in the 1960s, the site now served as an ideal base camp. We set up our tents and kindled a fire just as the sun began to descend, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground. Gathered around the flames, we lost ourselves in conversation. We reminisced about old adventures and shared new stories about our kids and jobs. I swear we must have been laughing the whole time. The stars emerged one by one, punctuating the deepening darkness of the sky. The world was still and at peace. Suddenly, though, John raised a hand, his expression turning serious. "Did you hear that?" he said. We all fell silent, the crackling of the fire punctuating the quiet night. Then I heard it too, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush. They were deliberate and unhurried, obviously drawing closer with each passing moment. We exchanged glances, a mixture of curiosity and caution. Perhaps a deer, we thought, or maybe a bear wandering nearby. But then, emerging from behind the veil of pine trees, a man stepped into the circle of firelight. We froze. He approached us as if strolling into a neighborhood bar. His walk was casual, his demeanor affable. A bright smile spread across his face. We were totally caught off guard and watched him approach in silence. His hair was disheveled, and he had thick stubble across his face, like he hadn't seen a bathroom in weeks. He was dressed in a well-fitting tailored suit, oddly pristine for someone trekking through the wilderness. The style was decades out of fashion. The seams were subtly frayed. What caught our attention most, though, were his shoes. White sneakers, spotless and unscuffed, improbably clean given the circumstances. It was like he walked out of his house and right into our camp. "Evening, gentlemen," he greeted us with a smile and a nod. In the shifting firelight, his age seemed ambiguous to me. What I mean is that he could have been 30 or maybe even 50. "Evening," we all replied hesitantly. "I'm Mike," he offered, taking a seat on a fallen log without invitation. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" "Sure is," Tyson replied with a slight waver. It made me feel a little better knowing my friends were just as bewildered about this situation as I was. We engaged in small talk, though the conversation felt forced. Mike mentioned that he was an accountant with a family, but when we asked for details, he either ignored the question or would wave it away dismissively, as if swatting at a persistent mosquito. What threw me off was his mispronunciation of his supposed hometown's name, though. He called it Boise and not Boise. That didn't sit well with me. It was like he was reciting lines from a script and was unable or unwilling to deviate and improvise. When he wasn't talking, he hummed a tune softly, swaying ever so slightly. His gaze drifted, not quite meeting ours, often focusing just beyond us into the darkness. It felt as if he were expecting someone or something to appear from the shadows almost. If he felt uneasy or worried about something, he certainly didn't show it on his happy face, though. Tyson finally broke the uneasy rhythm. "So, you out here camping alone?" he asked. Mike seemed momentarily puzzled, then smiled broadly. "Oh, just enjoying the wilderness," he replied. "You know, if something awful were to happen out here, it'd be a long time before anyone found out. This county's the size of Delaware, and they've only got 6 sheriff's deputies." He then chuckled, a sound hollow. An uncomfortable silence settled over us. John shot me a glance that mirrored my own unease. Huh, is that so? I managed to say. Yep, Mike continued, gazing up at the canopy of the stars. We're a long, long way from anywhere. His mood shifted abruptly, the jovial facade slipping into a vacant stare. The firelight cast eerie shadows across his face, deepening the lines and hollowing his features. Hey, are you feeling all right? John asked, truly worried about the guy. He snapped back into reality. That smile returned. Never better, he assured us. Don't worry, I'm not crazy or anything, boys. Not a murderer or a demon or anything. He sort of laughed lightly at this, but there was an unsettling edge to it. Tyson's patience was clearly wearing thin. Look, man, are you on something? You're acting kind of strange. Mike ignored the question, humming that same little melody. The sway returned, his eyes distant. I decided now that it was time to wrap things up. I tried the only method that made sense in the moment. Standing, I slapped my knee in that old Idaho way. Well, it's getting late, I said, forcing a smile. We've got an early morning ahead. Mike nodded slowly. Yes, lots to do. As he stood, a large hunting knife slipped from his jacket pocket, landing blade first into the soil. Oops, he said casually, retrieving it. Can't forget this. You never know what kind of crazy folks you might run into way out here, you know. We watched in tense silence as he slid the knife back into his pocket. His gaze swept over us one last time, still not quite meeting our eyes. You boys take care now, he said, softly. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the darkness, the sound of his footsteps fading into the quiet of the night. We stood there, the fire casting long shadows, the weight of the encounter settling upon us. Sleep, it didn't come easily that night. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the trees seemed amplified, our senses tuned to the slightest disturbance. The next morning, we debated whether to pack up and leave, but ultimately decided to stay. We had come here to reconnect after all, and weren't about to let one strange encounter ruin our trip. Yet, as we hiked through the mountains in search of elk, we just couldn't shake the feeling of being watched the whole time. We never did see Mike again, but his presence certainly lingered. An unspoken question hanging in the crisp mountain air above us. Who was he? What had brought him to our camp that night? Where did he go? We'll probably never know the truth, unfortunately. I grew up in a small town, primarily Hispanic, where everyone knew everything. We had something here and there, of course, but other than that, not too much stuff happens. I'm overweight, to put it simply, and not to the standards of beauty, really. I remember reading a meme online once where it was a joke about can't catch me or kidnap since you can't carry me, keep eating cake, and laughed at that and was like, so true. I didn't realize that would all come back and bite me, though. I was 18 to 19-ish, I believe anyway, and it was nighttime. My weed plug was doing a stash and dash, and being broke and desperate, I went for it. I figured, I grew up here and I know all the areas pretty well, and what made this more tempting too was that it was actually not far from my area at all. So I said, to heck with it. I was on a video call with my boyfriend and told him that I was going to go for it. He stays on the phone with me and I head out. Mind you, it's late. The areas that I have to cross through are not well lit, and I leave with nothing on me. Not even my taser, alarm, and pepper spray my dad always made me have. Oh, and to make things worse too, I snuck out because I didn't want my dad to know that I was hunting for weed. So, this is already starting out great, right? But I set off. I have to cross railroad tracks to get through to the area, which is pitch black, only the main road in the distance lighting it up, and some lights from a warehouse nearby. But other than that, it's pretty hard to see. I make my way towards the main road and notice a semi parked on the side of the road. Not unusual. Semis parked there all the time, ever since I was little in fact, so nothing too weird. Then I hear a holler or hey, and I look over there and see a man in a semi-truck. He looked generic. I'm not going to lie, a Mexican man with a red long sleeve. He looked like any other man that I'd seen around town. But his smile, I don't know, it just seemed a bit off. In any case, I waved, being polite. He gestured for me to come over and start speaking Spanish. But I don't know Spanish. I know what you're thinking. 1, why don't you know Spanish if you grew up in a Hispanic town? And 2, why aren't you running? My parents never taught me, so sue me. And 2, he was far, so I just kept walking. So I just sort of sheepishly respond, I don't speak Spanish, in Spanish. I learned that phrase just to say it to people, and wave him off quickly, walking away. My boyfriend asks me who's that, and I just tell him some random semi-truck driver. I go on with the night. I think I've been out for 40 minutes at this point, and realize that I'm not going to find it. Big sad, right? So I start heading home, still on the phone with my boyfriend. I keep talking and my phone is dying, which is actually what made my boyfriend tell me to go home. So I start walking back and I go down the road and look down the pitch black area where the railroad is, and I stopped. I just had a bad feeling all of a sudden. Something told me not to go home just yet. I tell my boyfriend that I'm going to go look at the other end of the street. That was towards where the warehouse was, giving off the light and passing empty trailers partially hidden by the shadows. I start walking and make it into the light, and I hear movement behind me and a hey. I turned around really quick and saw the same semi-truck driver again, with the same smile that he had before. He came out from behind a trailer that he was apparently hiding behind. He had his right hand tucked into his pocket and was positioning his body to where he was hiding whatever that he had more. He told me to come here and started getting closer to me. I immediately tell my boyfriend to wake up his dad and come to get me. I backed up quick and was trying really hard to think of what to do next. He saw me on the phone and immediately had a mad and annoyed look on his face. He stopped and actually started hiding behind the trailers more. Seeing that, I book it down the road telling my boyfriend to come and get me or have his dad come and get me. I didn't want to call my dad because even in this moment for some reason I was still terrified of getting caught sneaking out. I ran across the main road to the little mini-mart across the street and hid behind an ice machine. I told my boyfriend that I need to call someone and hang up on him and call my friend who, thank God, was out with his girlfriend. I tell him that I'm in danger and need him to come and get me, and then I tell him where I'm at. Now, while I was waiting for them, I stayed behind the ice machine, and while I was waiting there, I saw this guy Semi again. I saw him looking around for me and shake his head in disappointment before driving off. Even in that moment, I still didn't feel safe, not until my friend pulled up anyway. Everything just sort of hit me too once he got out of the car and I hugged him crying. His girlfriend and him calmed me down and took me home. I got a little bit of a lecture from my boyfriend, but I'd rather take that lecture than anything else I could have experienced that night. I was lucky, way too lucky. The false sense of security my weight and looks gave me really shattered after that too, and I'm glad for it. But I won't lie, it still terrifies me to think of just how things could have turned out if I didn't have my boyfriend on the phone with me that night. So this happened around a year ago, but I wrote this out in my notes around an hour after it had happened and forgot to share it. So my mum, stepdad and I, we're driving about 2.5 to 3 hours away to pick up our new motorhome. We stopped at the gas station and I ran inside with Mum to grab some food while my stepdad filled the motorhome with gas. Mum went to speak with him and I dropped my stuff off in the car and then went around to find her as she came around to find me. I came around the back of the motorhome and heard Mum say, "Why are you hiding?" And I assumed that she was talking to the dog in the car. I started sneezing, Sunlight makes me sneeze sometimes, I don't know why, and Mum turned to look at me. Her eyes got wide though, and she looked totally freaked out. I was confused and asked what had happened, assuming the dog was being weird. I got into the front seat as Mum did that weird stressed sort of panicked laugh cry thing, and this is the conversation that ensued. Mum, what happened? What did she, the dog, do? Mum didn't say anything, just sort of looked freaked. What is it? Was Ripley being weird? No, you. What? Why? I saw you in the back seat. Apparently, Mum got to the car and saw me laying on the floor of the back seat, grinning up at her like I was being goofy and trying to scare her. The "why are you hiding" comment was directed towards me when she heard me sneezing. Then she turned and she saw me, and her eyes got wide and she whipped back around to see that the me in the back seat had actually vanished. Mum, rightly so too, started crying because, yeah, that's freaky, right? I mean, imagine seeing a child in the back seat, being a little weirdo with a grin that doesn't seem menacing, but then hearing that same child in a different location and looking back to see the child in the car was now gone. The smile went from a "ha-ha, I'm so weird" to very menacing apparently and scary, she said. The other occurrence was similar too, this time involving my brother R, who was 16. This was a couple of months back, in fact. The details are a bit foggy, so bear with me. My brother was in the living room when I came out of my room and stopped in the door to the living room. He and I chatted for a minute, with him looking at me as we did. He looked down at his phone when it dawned on him that I had actually left over an hour before to go to the store. I wasn't home, in other words. He looked back up, and apparently I was gone. Around 20-ish minutes later, I returned home and he was still there, a little freaked out. He told me, and we were very confused as to what it could have been. On top of that, I've heard my family calling me numerous times, only to find that they haven't. The most notable involving R and Mum as well. One night I was at my desk and heard R call my name, so I got up, going to his room to see what he wanted. He said though that he didn't call me, but we stood talking for a minute. I turned on my heel to leave, and as I did, heard Mum call my nickname, Monkey. So I did a 180 heading to her room. But when I went in, she said that she hadn't called me either. It was memorable since it happened twice in a matter of minutes. I do know that we have at least 2 spirits in my house, one attached to my mum and one to me. Nothing has ever seemed hostile. I mean, the worst thing that they have done is move stuff around, which has made me late a few times, I'll admit, but apart from this, nothing else really sinister has happened, so I can only guess that, well, they're not evil or anything. This happened a few years back, but it stuck with me because of how weird and scary it was. So every year for the past few years, my parents have been going on a week-long anniversary trip, leaving me home alone. I was 20, so it was more than an appropriate age. And well, this time around, some weird stuff happened the first day that they were gone, and then this happened the night before they were supposed to come home. So the first day they were gone, a guy came to the door to drop something off in the morning, but I didn't want to answer it as it was a stranger, and I thought that he would just leave it at the door like usual. Well, he stayed for about 5 minutes, and then got into his car and started to drive off, to which I went outside because I thought that he'd finally left it. This man, though, got out of his car, leaving it in the middle of the road, just to give me my package that I didn't have to sign for at all. No signature needed for anything. Wasn't dressed like a delivery person. Was in a beat-up car. Very weird and uncomfortable for sure. Anyway, skipping to the end of the week, I was just chilling out in my living room, and all of a sudden at like 11 at night, I see this rather large figure approach my front door. The glass is dimpled, so you can't see features but just a silhouette, and starts banging on my door, and he did so for like a minute straight. He stands there and doesn't leave for probably 10 minutes, and in the time, he just beats on the door a few times over. Luckily, my sister and her family live not even a mile away from me, so I call them and her husband comes to get me. By this time, I'm in full panic mode and I realize that my dogs are in the backyard. But my back door is like 90% glass, and I was horrified that this person was going to come through the back gate and try to come into my house as my dogs were barking up a storm. Anyways, I get my dogs inside the house and my brother-in-law finally shows up, and whoever was there was now gone. He takes me to my sister's house and we check the front door cameras to see who was there. But the cameras, they had been turned off the whole time that this person was there, and for an hour before he started banging on my door. Which was weird because the cameras had been on before that time period and during the time that we were looking at the cameras. But they were somehow shut off for about an hour and a half, which was odd because they're not the type that needs to be charged and they've never glitched before then, but were actually very sensitive to any movement really. To this day, I still don't know who it was that showed up at the house that night. I checked the local news and everything, but nothing ever really came of it. I don't know if they were trying to rob my house or if they had other plans, or if it was potentially the weird delivery guy from earlier that week, but it still freaks me out to think about it, and I hate being home alone at night now because of it. Truth be told, I'm not sure what this is. Maybe a mimic, a ghost. I'm not really sure, but maybe someone out there can tell me what they think. This happened several years ago. My sister and her husband were going on vacation for a few days and asked me to dog sit for them. They have quite a few dogs. I agreed as I've dog sat for them a number of times before then and since then too. The first night I stayed over that week, their rather elderly yellow lab Lacey started to get a little bit agitated. It was about 10 p.m. and I thought maybe Lacey was nervous because it was close to bedtime and my sister and brother-in-law weren't home. As I mentioned, Lacey was elderly and going blind and deaf, and I thought that she might be having some separation anxiety. I tried to reassure her, and I figured that sticking to her usual routine as much as possible would help calm her nerves a bit. She usually slept in their bedroom, so I was trying to coax her in there to go to bed. I said, "Come on, Lacey, go lay down." I said something similar in a calming tone several times, but after the final time, I heard a voice repeat back to me, "Go lay down." It was a man's voice, and it was crystal clear. It was so clear, in fact, that for a second I thought maybe my sister and her husband had come home early. But then I realized that I would have heard the garage door open. They always use the garage door instead of the front door to go in and out of the house. Plus, the other dogs would have lit up with barking excitement if they had walked in. I looked around and nobody was there. Like I said too, I have dog sat for them many times, and that is the only time I have ever experienced anything like that. To this day, I still don't know what it was. I'm not typically a believer in the paranormal or anything, but I just cannot explain it. I don't remember exactly how old I was, but I would estimate I was 15 or 16, living in Golden, Colorado at the time. I spent a lot of time with my good friend Kat, who lived in a double-wide trailer with her mum, Chris. When I first met them, they had a roommate renting their spare room, but after he moved out, it turned into a bit of a hobby supply dumping ground for a while. It was a nice-sized room with an attached bathroom, so Chris eventually dedicated a few days to getting things organized, moving in a twin-size bed and old TV, and making it a functional guest room. What had previously been mountains of fabric and uncontained bobbins of thread, random boxes of buttons and free-roaming skeins of yarn, was suddenly a clean and inviting bedroom, with a closet of neatly labeled boxes and drawers, everything folded and in its own predetermined place. Chris was so excited to show it off to me, as she knew that I would be the person sleeping in there most frequently, and it was a great upgrade from either the couch or the floor of Kat's room. Now, when Kat and I had sleepovers, our favorite pastime was to stay up late getting good and creeped out. Slender Man was first gaining popularity in creepypastas, Marble Hornets was being released on the Tube of You, and we were falling down the rabbit hole, not quite sure whether it was all made up or if there was some truth to the stories and sightings being frequently recounted all over the internet. But this was the first night that I would have to pick myself up after our Fright Fest and go sleep alone in the newly appointed guest room. It had gotten late that night. We had run out of new creepy online videos, and we had even played a few rounds of the recently released Slender game on her laptop. Much as I didn't want to, it was time for bed, and so I went across the hall, climbed into the slightly squeaky metal-framed bed, and took a few deep breaths to help calm myself asleep. My eyes were closed, and my body was starting to relax. But that was when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps creaking across the floor inside of my room. My hair immediately stood up on end, all over my arms, and I could feel the familiar tingle of adrenaline in the nape of my neck. My eyes, they flew back open, and I put my glasses on because I felt too vulnerable to be blind in that moment. I scanned the room in the dim light from the street lamp coming from the window, and I saw nothing. Yet the sounds of the footsteps continued, uninterrupted and more distinguishable than ever. They started near the door, made their way diagonally through the room to the small table where the boxy 1980s TV was set up, paused, moved from the TV to the doorless closet, paused again. To my building sense of dread, the steps then came forward to me, getting closer until I could feel the energy of someone standing directly next to the bed and gazing at me curiously. Then they moved on, walking over to a giant teddy bear propped against a wall in his very own chair, pause, before going back over to the TV and beginning to repeat the same round that they had just completed. In complete shock and amazement, I realized that I couldn't possibly be imagining this, as the steps made the same rotation throughout the room, at least 2 or 3 or more full times, always pausing at each location, including right next to me, which was my least favorite, and exuding an energy of curiosity. The footsteps sounded small and light, the stride short enough that it required 3 or 4 steps every time the being moved only a few feet in any direction. I was on edge at the oddness of this experience, but there was no negative energy coming from the being as it traipsed about the room. I suddenly realized that I simply knew it was a child, curious about the changes in the room and taking its time to check out all the new fixtures in the space, including me. I also knew that I couldn't stare at nothing all night, following the path of the child I could hear but not see, so I finally took my glasses back off and tried to lay back down, thinking that if I ignored it and let it satisfy its curiosity, then the discomforting noises would eventually stop. Well, they didn't. With all the boundless energy and determination of a child, the creaks continued their repetitive journey around the room, so consistently that I could very soon predict where they would be next, how many steps it would take to get there, and how long they would pause to stare at whatever was in front of them before moving again to the next station. I was no longer scared, but neither could I relax. I felt foolish even as I fixed my mouth to speak, but I decided to address the entity out loud. I know things are suddenly very different in here and you're just trying to check everything out, but it's also the middle of the night and I can't sleep with you making all this noise in here. Could you please stop for the night so I can get some rest? Finally, all the heightened energy just left the room. My hairs laid back down and my neck stopped tingling, and I heard only silence. I got comfortable in the bed again, took a few more deep breaths to resettle my nervous system, and soon I fell asleep. The next morning, I was in the living room eating breakfast and telling Kat and Chris all about my experience the night before. My mum was going to arrive to pick me up soon, so I was finishing my story. I had stood up and made my way to the entrance of the hallway so that I could go back to the guest room and grab my overnight bag. I was facing them, telling them how I had finally gotten some peace and quiet, then pivoted to walk up the hall. Well, that had been the intention, but all I could do was turn before I was stopped, in my tracks, unable to take a single step forward, because standing directly in front of me was a little girl. She looked solid and real though, and I would have thought a random neighborhood kid had found her way into the trailer, except she was all in grayscale. I would guess that she would have been about 6 or 7 years old, and wearing a dress with a little white square apron that belonged in the late 1910s or early 20s. Her hair was straight and jaw-length, and I could tell that she was a dark blonde with a small ribbon bow on one side of her head that I knew was pale blue, in spite of not actually seeing any color on her. She looked up at me with a sweet small smile on her face and a twinkle in her eye, and then said, "I know you can see me, and I know you were just talking about my visit last night." She stood there in front of me for a good couple of seconds, before turning to the side and leaning forward to follow a cat that I couldn't see, allegedly, trying to scoop up something at least, and she walked after it, directly through the wall. In shock, I slowly turned back around to face Kat and Chris again. They could both tell that something had transpired, and I know that I had a look on my face that was half grin and half stunned disbelief. "What just happened?" Chris asked excitedly. "You probably won't even believe me if I tell you," I gasped out. "We will. We know this house is weird. What was it?" she insisted. I then described the girl. "I knew it, Kat. Didn't I always say it felt like there was a little girl in here? I've been saying that for years," Chris screamed. Kat sort of chuckled and nodded, begrudgingly admitting that yes, Kat had said that many times before. By now, my mum would be showing up any minute, so I went to the back room, gathered up my pajamas and toothbrush, and quietly said a goodbye to this little girl. "You can come visit me again if you want, just not in the middle of the night next time, okay?" I said to the empty room, feeling a little stupid. And though I stayed many more nights in that home, I never did see or hear from that little girl ever again. I fell asleep on the couch pretty early last night, 10:30ish. Usually, my significant other wakes me up and tells me to go to bed. However, we got into an argument earlier in the evening, and I think he was like, "I'm leaving her out there." Well, a bit after midnight, I heard 3 loud stomps, and this scared me half to death, so I woke up immediately. As soon as I opened my eyes, I saw one of my dog's toys floating about 4 feet above the floor, a small lamb chop plushie with all of the stuffing ripped out. It was rotating a tiny bit and then was entirely still for a second. Then it started to slowly lower itself onto the floor. As soon as it was on the floor, I looked over at my dog, and we both ran to the bedroom. I got into bed. My significant other was awake, and I said, "There's something in the living room." He looked at me and pretty much brushed me off and told me to go to bed. It took me forever to calm down enough to fall asleep, and then I repeatedly woke up through the night. I kept thinking, or dreaming, about someone holding the dog toy, realizing that I was looking at them and then them slowly putting it down. In other words, I was really uneasy all night. I told my significant other about it in the morning before going to work, but he just said something along the lines of, "That's so weird," and then proceeded to take our dog outside to go potty. I didn't push the subject because I was so freaked out and also exhausted because I hardly slept. Fast forward to around 10:30ish this morning though, I texted my significant other and was like, "Did you get what I was saying about the creepy thing?" And he responded with, "Yes, the bed was shaking before you came in." I said, "You're lying," but he swore up and down that he was telling the truth. I also texted my siblings in our group chat, and they gave the usual, "Oh my goodness, so creepy" responses. But one of my sisters said, "3 loud stomps to mock the Holy Trinity," and I wasn't sure what she meant. I mean, I'm not religious at all, but I googled it, and I guess 3 loud stomps, knocks, or thumps represent demonic presences in Christianity. I got chills all over as I read that. This entire time, I've felt like the 3 loud stomps were from downstairs. I live above a bar, so that part of the experience didn't really scare me too much. I also was thinking that maybe I was just hallucinating since I was only awake for half a second before I saw what I saw. It was the floating dog toy that scared the living heck out of me, and for a while, I felt like everything that I experienced was purposeful and maybe even evil. My significant other and I thought that maybe we had invited evil into the apartment because we had been watching and listening to nothing but horror stuff due to it being October. We also think that our argument maybe caused a lot of negative energy as well, that maybe allowed what was already present to manifest itself the way that it did. At this point though, I feel like maybe I was just hallucinating because I woke up so suddenly, and maybe the bed was shaking due to movement downstairs. I don't believe in ghosts, demons, the afterlife, but I feel like life would be more meaningful if I did. I'm a property manager and a 1-year postpartum, so I return to my company part-time. This is fun because I get to sort of float around to different apartment communities who need help and just help where needed. In September, I helped at a property about an hour from my house. It's a bit of a drive, but fairly small property, with relatively no big problems, so easy money for the day. I'm covering for a manager out on vacation, and of course it's the dreaded 6th of the month. This means that I'm handing out late letters and making calls, unfortunately. Definitely not my favorite part of the job, but it is necessary. The one thing that I hate about floating though is the residents don't know me well. So I'm delivering late letters and calling and they don't even know me. Again, not my favorite part of the job, but it has to be done. So, I had about 10 late letters to deliver that day. All was going normal and fine. Some people answer the door and say, "Yep, sorry, I'll have it paid on such and such date." Another person didn't answer, so I left info on the door, but they flipped me off as I was walking away. All pretty normal stuff, to be honest, that just comes with the job. But I get down to about the 7th or 8th person. I walk up to this apartment, and I can tell from the outside the occupants have absolutely destroyed this home. I smelled cigarettes, cat urine, and just a general mustiness before I even knocked. All the blinds were broken, blankets up on the window, all the works. I get up to the door, do my normal quick knock, waited about 5 seconds and was ready to post notice to the door. Right as I was folding it up to put it between the door partly swings open. A gentleman, wearing just boxers and a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, opens the door but doesn't unlatch the security lock, so the door's not opened all the way. "What do you want?" he says as he's giving me a death glare, but also looking me up and down inappropriately at the same time. I explain that I was just here to deliver the late letters and that I would be on my way now. As I'm explaining this, I notice that he keeps looking over his shoulder, as if someone is standing next to him behind the door. I find this a bit odd, as if someone is hiding from me, especially because this gentleman won't open the door all the way. I hear some whispering, and now I'm sure that he's communicating with someone. The gentleman in the doorway asks me to wait and says that he has things in his apartment that he needs looked at. I explain that I was just here for the letter, but that he can send some photos into the office, and that I would get work orders in. He begins complaining about our maintenance team and states that he really wants someone to take a look in person. At this point, I'm feeling really uneasy. Typically speaking, I would enter and help no problem usually, but between the looks this guy was giving me and the creepy who knows who is behind the door, I'm just not feeling safe at this point. I defer again, trying to make myself sound unimportant and just say, "I'm just a floating person. I can't do anything without manager approval until she gets back, so really there's no point." At this point, someone catches my eye upstairs though. I see a window blind move. I notice 2 additional guys upstairs who are both staring down at me. I'm so uneasy now too that I could be sick. I tell the gentleman that I won't be entering without maintenance or the property manager present, due to it being an ongoing maintenance concern and there not being much that I can personally do anyway. He looks annoyed and finally just slams the door in my face. I get back to the office and grab the maintenance supervisor for the property to chat things over regarding this encounter. The maintenance supervisor explained to me that there used to be an old man who lived in that apartment, but then his son took over the lease after he died. He told me that he's noticed a lot of strange activity and individuals around that home since the dad died, but he hasn't personally witnessed anything illegal yet, so he's just let it go for now. He explained that they plan to make the move when the contract is over due to the condition of the home alone anyways, but while I cannot prove something horrible was going to happen, if I entered the premises that is, this is by far the creepiest encounter that I've had in property management in all my 7 years. This is an old story about my first paranormal experience that happened at least 17 years ago. This happened back when I was around 5 years old. I lived in a trailer with my parents on a hill in an isolated area in the middle of the woods, with the only family and friends of the family living within the mountainous area around us. One Saturday, I asked my parents if my cousin Sarah, 6 and female, could stay the night since she only lived a few minutes away. My parents agreed and picked Sarah up at around 8 p.m. Me and Sarah ended up staying pretty late talking while my parents fell asleep in the living room. My bedroom is in the middle of the trailer with 2 open doorways to the hallway, and since I had no doors, we could always see the light from the living room to mine. Well, as me and Sarah were talking, suddenly Sarah just stopped talking and turned her head towards the end of my bed. My bed was one of those bunk beds that had like storage cabinets on the bottom instead of another bed, so we were a bit elevated from the ground. But I noticed her face had a look of horror, so I asked her what was wrong, and she told me that there's something standing at the end of the bed. I turned to quickly look, and I saw a white-looking figure standing still at the end of the bed. I was quick to believe that it was probably just the clothes basket, and that stuff like that can look scary in the dark, and so that's what I told her. I thought that I knew that too, because I've mistaken objects in the dark for other things before. I was just trying to rationalize the situation, I guess, so that Sarah wouldn't be afraid to come over again, and so I told her that I'll prove it to her, that it's just the basket at the end of the bed. Sarah begged me, though, to not do this, but I already started crawling to the end of my bed. I stared at what looked like a tall white blobbish figure, and looked back at Sarah and stuck my hand right through the figure. My heart instantly dropped when I swatted my hand around and felt nothing. No basket, no object at all. But strangely, it felt like I stuck my hand in the freezer. I quickly turned to look back at the figure with my hand still in it and saw it form what looked like a face. I scrambled back to Sarah as fast as I could in absolute horror. Me and Sarah were freaking out at the other end of the bed, staring at this thing. Seeing it in that moment, it almost looked like a white silhouette of a man with long hair. He just stood there, not moving in the slightest, though. Eventually, we came to the conclusion, though, that our only options were that if one of us can either turn the lights on or run to the living room to get my parents, that the figure might eventually go away. Me and Sarah argued who would be the one to do it, and eventually I caved in and just went for the light switch. I took one last glance at the figure before flipping the switch, and once the lights came on, it was gone. And so I flipped it back off just to be sure, and yep, it had disappeared for good, it seemed. Me and my cousin ended up staying up until morning that night, too scared to sleep. I've told my family about this and found out that our yard and most of the mountain area was actually native burial grounds. In fact, locals around the area nickname it Witches' Mountain, since there has also been reports of witches living in the area back in the day. My family is very religious and don't like speaking much about the history, so I'm really sorry I cannot provide more information regarding that, as I was never really allowed to look into it. 17 years later, though, both me and Sarah, we still remember this experience like it was just yesterday. My wife and I have been living in our apartment for about 6 months now, and strange things started occurring about maybe a month ago. My dog is always staring at things around the house, growling at something that doesn't seem to be there. A few weeks ago, my wife was lying in bed and felt a motherly touch push her hair back, like a real human touch. She was completely alone in the room, mind you, with all windows and doors shut. There was no wind or anything either. Then recently, it happened again and she came out of the room feeling creeped out. But the most frightening thing just happened recently. In the middle of the night, while we were sleeping, our dog barked like crazy at the dark hallway and ran into it. But we sprinted after him, checked the whole house, and we found nothing. We played it off as a bad dream of his, but then we all went back to sleep and I had a terrible nightmare. I woke up in a sleep paralysis episode with my dog staring at me. His mouth was moving and a man's voice was screaming at me to get out, over and over, getting faster and louder. My wife then had to wake me up as I was whimpering and couldn't move. I'm not a big believer in the paranormal, but this has become very terrifying for us. My wife and I are just looking for explanations at this point. She thinks that someone nearby in our apartment complex might be doing rituals or something. We found this white goo a couple of feet outside of our door that won't go away recently, like candle wax or something. Any help or explanation would be appreciated because we just want life to go back to normal. This happened around 2010 to 2012. My house was extremely old. Multiple people died in that home too. There were nice people that my neighbors knew of in there, and they had apparently died in there, like a World War II vet who was really nice to my friends before I lived on that street. He left some things behind, like a bayonet attachment to his rifle, and I still have that to this day. My friend who saw the man alive around 2004 slept over my house around 2009 and said that he saw the ghost of that old man walking towards his battle blade in my room and faded away as he got it. But as more and more friends slept over, I had a lot of friends at that time. They all said the same thing. Something felt off about my house. It was just creepy, and they sensed something at night. My dog, she would violently growl or bark at, well, nothing, and specifically growl or bark at my sister's room when it was empty. My sister and I one night heard what sounded like footsteps upstairs in her room, moving furniture in her room. We heard forks and spoons being tossed around in the kitchen. Keep in mind, this was before iPhones. My sister was in a separate room than me, and we came together the next morning to realize that we had both heard the same things going on in separate rooms, which we found insane. But then there was the experience. So one night, I was getting ready to go to sleep. I didn't have a door in my bedroom for many years, which I know sounds weird, but that's just how it went in my house. My dad at the time, he was severely depressed, drinking a lot and neglecting the house and basically the family too, which I believe ties to the negative energy in that house. But I was laying down, closing my eyes as I wanted to fall asleep. The house was dead silent, and no joke, I felt a hard slap across my face, left cheek. So I automatically assumed it was my younger siblings playing a joke on me. I looked around my bed, my room, called their names, and I got nothing. The house was pitch black, and I went to lay back down and close my eyes, laying on my back this time. Didn't really think too much of it, and I wasn't scared really at all. But then 2 or so minutes go by, and another slap across the face, but this time the opposite side of my face, the right side. At this point, I feel annoyed, but also alarmed for sure. Something was off. I repeated the same search, and nobody was in my room or hiding on the stairs. My sister's room was across the hall upstairs. Her door was 4 feet away from my door, and if I laid on my side, I could see directly into her room if her door was open. At this point, I was really uncomfortable and sort of freaked out. I laid on my side with my eyes closed, and that was when I suddenly felt, well, what I can only describe as a presence. an energy that I had never felt before. Something told me to open my eyes, so I did, and I regret that to this day. What I saw was a tall black figure, out of this world and definitely not human. I could tell that it was not of our world because it seemed to be, well, not totally in our realm, if that makes sense, like it was phasing a bit. I couldn't tell if it was 3 feet away from me or 13 feet away, but I saw my sister's room open, and I could basically see as if it was hunched over my sister's bed in her room. It was absolutely terrifying. So I just sort of sat there, paralyzed, frozen, not knowing what to do. Eventually, though, I fell asleep staring at it. I woke up terrified, and I went to school feeling off that day. I walked home that day, and I waited 2 hours outside of my house until somebody else got home. I saw that figure a final second time one night. I was playing Xbox 360, the good old days, right, with my best friend, and we were talking online late at night, when suddenly his voice went out and I just didn't hear anything from him. That's when I felt that tense feeling again, like I was being watched. This time I didn't have a door yet, but I had a sort of thin white blanket nailed to the door frame to act as some type of privacy door or blanket. But when I decided to look at my door, I saw it again. This black figure staring at me, only peeping its head in between the blanket and the door frame. At this point, it is physically touching real-life objects and altering them by having me see the blanket wrapping around its peeking head. It stared at me, and I decided to scream loud for my sister this time. I screamed her name, Jen, 3 times, until I heard her footsteps come stumbling to my room, and as she flung the makeshift blanket door in the air to enter, the entity just disappeared with the movement of the blanket. She seemed really confused and asked if I was okay. I told her what I thought I saw, and, well, I never saw that thing again after that. Other weird things about that house too is that my dog saw things that we couldn't see. My father was depressed and drinking, losing his mind. My mother tried to delete herself, but she survived, thank God. My brother became depressed, and he also had thoughts of the same thing in that house. My sister became addicted to drugs in that house, which didn't last long and went away quickly, thankfully. And then this happened to me. I truly believe that this house, it was cursed, because things have been so much better since we moved from there, and I'm really thankful for that. When I was 5 or 6 years old, 20 years back now, my mum and I moved into this small home in the country. No property size, but still no neighbours or anything. Like 5 minutes from a Walmart too. The first experience happened in my bedroom. My bed was against the farthest left wall corner next to a window, and the door was to the farthest right corner. My room was always clean as we simply didn't have enough stuff to make it cluttered. I remember waking up though and just sort of knowing something was there, in the corner near the door. How? Because I remember thinking to myself, just close your eyes and everything will be okay. But I couldn't. I turned and had seen this lump, a figure made from my clothing, as in it was taller than me or anything that I could have piled there. So in a shot in the dark, I beelined to my mum, who was in the room adjacent to me, and said that there was someone there. When she came and turned on the light, she told me to come inside. Clothes were absolutely everywhere, all over the floor, and just a chaotic mess flung around all over the room. She asked me if I did this, and I said no. Needless to say, I didn't sleep in my room that night. Now, the second is what actually traumatized me, as in the specific action prior to the encounter made me panic for 6 years afterward. Flushing the toilet, I would have this deep anxious feeling no matter where and would run out of the washroom afterward. The washroom had only one entry and the window was too small for a person to fit through. The toilet was right next to the door as well. But I did my business and flushed, and when I turned, there stood an old man. He was bearded, clean, and he just stood there looking at me. When I finally found my voice, I absolutely screamed. My mum and I described it like a blood-curdling scream, as if I had just cut off my finger or something. She came into me, closing my eyes, hands covered them, and saying that there was a man in there with me. It took her some time to console me, to open and talk further, but when I did, we didn't stay much longer in that house. It's probably important to state too that my mum was the one who verified my stories as an adult. Since then, I've spent years trying to either connect with whatever sense that I had, to see that person, or dismiss what I had seen as something else, but I just can't. Between the long-term fear, anxiety, trauma from the event, to my mum's own account of the event secondhand, I can't find an actual explanation for whatever occurred that day. So my uncle, a wallpapering expert, and my father, a skilled carpenter, teamed up for a project one day. An old white Victorian house nestled in the quiet seclusion of rural Connecticut. For my 13-year-old self and my 11-year-old cousin, this was more than just a renovation project. It was an open invitation to explore our fascination with the supernatural. This particular house, it felt like hitting the jackpot too. The property sprawled across several acres, boasting a built-in greenhouse. Further out, a dilapidated shed leaned at the yard's edge, where the forest began. Even without any ghost stories, the entire scene possessed a certain eerie charm, which is a quality often found in the old homes of the East Coast, to be honest. Left to our own devices, we approached the back of the house at the kitchen entrance. A basement door loomed wide open by the entrance with an immediate unwelcome vibe. A certain sense settled over me, a feeling that something resided here and it wasn't exactly good. Despite the thrill of quenching my curiosities, the urge to remain in the yard for the rest of the afternoon was almost overwhelming. But my cousin, well, he was too bold for this. As we ventured deeper into the house, a profound dread came over me, each step feeling heavier than the last. My body seemed to resist the house almost. My cousin, meanwhile, was claiming to hear things and became fixated on exploring the attic. Honestly, I was already beyond done with this place though at this stage. Even my 13-year-old brain registered that this was not a good place. All I wanted to do was go and sit in the car, and that was that. But we made our way up to the attic, and to my relief, it had been renovated. Despite the lingering unease, it wasn't the least bit creepy visually, which was a relief. There was even a small TV, which I turned on, sitting on the floor in front of it. But my cousin's attention was snagged by a closed door. He stood there before it, completely still, gaze fixed. Now, this was an 11-year-old who is usually a whirlwind of energy, constantly talking or making sounds, so their sudden silence spoke volumes. I tried to ignore it, but then they grabbed the knob and began yanking on it, but the door wouldn't budge. So logically, it was likely an unfinished storage area. The wood was probably swollen shut from moisture or whatever, and looking back now, though, I think that maybe I was wrong. I stood up to help them, and the door was genuinely jammed, but they became almost frantic, and their insistence on opening it was bordering on aggression. It was super disturbing to see them like this. I started pulling with all my strength, and the door finally gave way with a strong burst. I fell backwards, still gripping the doorknob, as a sudden, powerful gust of wind swept over us, whipping our hair back. My cousin screamed, a sound of pure terror, frozen in place, eyes wide. By the time that I regained my balance and rushed to see what they were seeing, there was nothing. But I swear the sheer terror was real from them. This particular room was the true attic as well, unfinished with splintered wood, random old antiques scattered about, and a grimy old window. Upon looking in, an intense wave of nausea suddenly hit me. I instantly slammed that door without even a second thought. A primal fear suddenly surged through me, and I immediately scooped my cousin and bolted down the stairs, out of that house and into that yard. And up to this day, even now, they won't tell me what they saw. They just laugh it off and change the subject, really. And it leaves me constantly questioning, was that terror just a figment of my overactive imagination? Or was it something tangible? The feeling was so intense, so visceral, that it made me feel physically ill. I don't know the history of the house, but deep down in my soul, I feel that something truly awful must have happened there. In the summer of 2023, I was camping with my family in Beaver Creek Campground in Montana for a few nights while visiting Yellowstone. And the first night there was the most unsettling experience that I have ever had. So my mother, stepfather, and his brother, they had all gone to sleep at around midnight while I stayed up for about an hour by the fire. It was pitch black when I decided to snuff the fire out and head to my tent to sleep for the night. After about 20 minutes of laying in my tent, I began to hear sniffing noises immediately outside of my tent. Fearing that it was a bear, I was completely frozen. This continued for a while until I heard the familiar breathing and shaking noises of that of a dog. I relaxed a bit, supposing that a nearby camper's dog had wandered off or something. I stopped hearing the dog after a while, but then I heard footsteps walking around our campsite, and the sound of a large stick being dragged along the ground all around. I was frozen in fear again at the possibility of a stranger walking around our campsite in pitch-black darkness. Suddenly, though, an obvious camera flash had gone off right in front of my tent. I was frozen, solid in fear. Later, it felt as though an animal or a person had laid down or cradled the corner of my tent as well. I felt a presence for maybe about 5 minutes and kept feeling as if something was lightly fidgeting with the corners of the tent. Still frozen, I prayed for this to stop. But then I was forced to make this person, or whatever, acknowledge my awareness of the situation when I sensed another's touch on the zipper of my tent door. I called out loudly, "Who's there?" My stepdad awoke and called out to me while I was too afraid to open my door. 10 seconds passed when I knew that he was out of his tent with his gun, and then I finally emerged. However, there was nothing there, and after I called out, I didn't hear or sense any movement going away from the campsite. All the while, too, my mum and stepdad have a dog in their tent which reacted to nothing the whole time. Well, that was enough for me. I slept in the car the next 2 nights, and thankfully nothing else happened. But I'm here to ask you guys if anyone has had any weird encounters like this in Montana near Yellowstone, or just in general, really. Thanks for listening to my story, and if you have any idea about what any of this could have been about, then please do share. This happened at my sister's house in 2019. For context, my sister had just bought this house and moved in. I invited a friend to stay with me in the guest room for my first night in her house as well. Her name is Anna, and the guest room had a trundle bed underneath a single bed. I was sleeping on the single bed, and Anna was sleeping on the trundle bed just below, but right next to me. Now, to paint a bit of a picture, the guest room was a standard square shape. The trundle bed was right up on the right wall. There was one window in the middle of the room that overlooked the driveway in the front yard as well, but there was enough space to roll the trundle bed out and not to have to stand on the mattress to see out the window. The curtains were a sort of tully fabric that let some light in as well. Now, I'm a very light sleeper in new places, and I know that I woke up because I sensed this presence was in the room. I opened my eyes to see Anna staring at the window, curtains half open. There was plenty of moonlight to see her, and she was standing still, staring straight forward. Her face was only 4 inches from the glass at this stage. And the first thing that I noticed was just how rigid she seemed with her arms by her sides. Now, I wasn't paralyzed, and in the moment I just sort of woke up and was looking at my friend. Nothing to be scared of, right? I propped my upper body up with my elbow in bed to get a vertical look at her. There was enough light to see her freckles clearly, and I asked what she was doing. But she didn't answer me. I said, "Anna, what are you doing?" And then she replied, "Who?" in a flat, low, but still feminine voice. I repeated, "Anna, what are you doing?" She again said, "Who?" in the same way. And this is where fear finally set in. Up until now, I was using an unfazed voice. I got that uncanny valley feeling as I was staring at her, though, and after that eerie feeling set in, I looked down at the trundle bed, and I saw Anna asleep below me. I was looking at Anna sleeping while Anna was standing right next to herself. And when I tell you that my stomach dropped, that is an understatement. My heart began racing, and I looked back and up and said, "Anna," one more time. This time, this thing snapped its head toward me so fast. We locked eyes, and I just shouted, "What the heck?" as I hurled myself against the wall. After I yelled and jostled the bed, Anna finally woke up. The real Anna, that is. She muttered, "What are you doing?" This made me look down at her, and once I looked back up at her, the fake one had vanished. I checked the time, and it was 2:40 in the morning, and I just said, "What the heck was that?" I explained what I saw to Anna, and I got up and reenacted it for her and shut the curtains. She doesn't like me bringing it up, and look, I get it. I wouldn't like hearing that sort of entity was standing right next to me too and wearing my face like that. But it was exactly her. When we locked eyes, hers were so empty and cold though. I can never forget those eyes, and I truly believe that this was not sleep paralysis. I mean, I was fully awake and processing. Whatever happened, it was real. I don't think it was a fabrication made by my brain either. I mean, I'm perfectly sane, never had any mental health issues or anything. In 2009, the thought of an entity that takes the face of a loved one was not something that I even knew about, in fact. I still don't really know too much or anything really. I just don't like remembering those eyes, and I'm a believer and a fan of the paranormal for sure, but this was frightening. I suppose I would like to know what it is, but I also don't want it to come back, so yeah. Thanks for listening, and here's hoping that I never have to experience anything like that again. So I'm male and 29, and this happened to me and my then girlfriend. It was the middle of July in 2011. I was a 15-year-old teenager, completely clean from any alcohol, drugs, or anything like that. In fact, I was very athletic at the time and loved sports. I would even describe myself as a pretty responsible and grounded kid for my age. That summer though, like every year, I was spending my vacation at my grandparents' village, a small place of around 400 people. There were always kids to play with, and we would stay out together from afternoon until sometimes around 2 or 3 in the morning. My grandparents gave me a freedom that I never had with my parents. In their backyard there were 2 houses as well, and one was built by my great-grandparent, was over 100 years old. The other newer one though was built by my grandfather. That summer, for the 2nd year in a row, I decided to live by myself in the old house, and my grandparents stayed in the other one for the time being. During the day, I helped my grandfather with farm work. We had a sort of small farm there. A lot of hard work, and in the evenings I went out with friends and came back whenever I wanted. Honestly, it felt like absolute freedom, and I loved it. At that time, I also had a girlfriend from my school back in the capital city. I was deeply in love, and it was my first love, full of innocent excitement. We talked on the phone daily. And one night, a big summer storm was approaching. The village lost power, no lights, no street lamps, complete darkness. It started pouring and thundering so hard that there was no way anyone could go outside. It was around 11 o'clock when I decided to go to bed. Outside, the storm was so fierce that the thunder made my bed shake, and it was really windy the whole evening. Surprisingly, I fell asleep pretty quickly that night. Now, the next thing that I remember was waking up to the sound of my phone ringing, a Nokia 6303 next to me. When I opened my eyes, what I noticed first was that the storm had completely passed. Clear sky, calm air, the streetlights were back on. I looked at my phone and it showed my girlfriend's name. I answered the call, put the phone to my ear while laying down, closed my eyes, and we started talking, greeting each other and asking what the other was doing. I remember feeling extremely sleepy, and very shortly after answering, maybe 10 to 20 seconds after that, I must have fallen asleep because, honestly, I remember nothing else. Anyway, the next morning I woke up normally. While sitting on the toilet, I remember, oh yeah, she called me last night. Curious about what we talked about too, I checked all of my call history. I received a call at 12:26 a.m., lasting exactly 1 minute and 35 seconds. I thought, that's pretty odd, and immediately called her to ask what we had talked about after these first 10 to 20 seconds of conversation because I couldn't remember anything else. At first, she laughed, thinking that I was joking. What do you mean you don't remember? And what 1 minute and a half are you talking about? She asked. I explained that according to my call log, our conversation lasted only about 1 minute and 35 seconds. Then she got quiet for a moment. And that's all you remember? She asked again. She said that after she first called me, we talked for about a minute or so, during which I told her that my phone battery was dying and that I'd call her back using my cousin's phone, since we were supposedly together at that time. She agreed, and we intentionally ended the call, and about 20 seconds later, she received a call from an unknown number. When she answered, it was apparently me again, or it sounded exactly like me. And she says that we talked for 45 minutes straight. I apparently told her that it was my cousin's phone and that she could save the number. We talked about personal things only she and I knew. I acted completely normal, using familiar names and references. Nothing felt off to her. She said that there was no way that she could mistake my voice. We were in love and spoke to each other daily at this stage. Plus, no random stranger could possibly have known that much about us, right? Well, near the end of the 45 minutes, she says that my mood had suddenly changed, and I ended the call just sort of abruptly. Right after, she received a text from the same unknown number that said, "I love you, little mouse. Everything's fine and we'll talk tomorrow. Sweet dreams." And then a heart emoji. We had specific nicknames for each other, and I never in my life called her little mouse before. She found it strange, but also kind of sweet, and just sort of brushed it off. And when she told me all of this, for a second I was sitting there, just mouth wide open. Then I laughed, and I didn't believe it. I was alone at the house that night. There was a storm, no electricity, and I had gone to sleep early. My cousin wasn't even at the village at the time. I couldn't believe her at first, and I thought that she was genuinely messing with me, but when I returned to the city a week later and we met up, she showed me her call history. First call, 1 minute and 35 seconds, just like it was on mine. And then the second call was an in-call from an unknown number, about 45 minutes long. Then a minute later, this same text message from an unknown number. Well, we decided to call the strange number from her phone, but I was going to do the speaking. A man answered almost immediately, a complete stranger, sounded maybe in his mid-30s to us, and he told us that he was living in the capital with his family. He was very cooperative when we explained the situation briefly. He said that he had no idea who we were, had never called or texted my girlfriend's number, and when he checked his outgoing messages, there was also no record of the text that we received. My girlfriend swore, though, that she didn't recognize this guy's voice at all. We didn't want to keep him long, so we just said thanks and we ended the call. Afterward, we just sort of sat on the park bench, completely freaked out, speechless for minutes. Neither of us could explain what had happened. Years later, we went our separate ways, each now with families and children even. But even now, 14 years later, when we see each other, we sometimes still talk about that night, how we felt and the storm that took place, and the most bizarre thing that she was talking with me for almost an hour, but it wasn't me. We never found a satisfying explanation for this too, and we're still just very perplexed by it. We speculated that maybe it was some kind of a cell network glitch or something, some weird signal crossover or whatever, but even then, how did the stranger or whatever was speaking have all the personal details to carry a 45-minute conversation like this? How did a text message get sent from somebody else's number without him even knowing it? Nothing like this has ever happened again, but it is the strangest thing that has ever happened to me. So if anyone here has experienced something similar, or has any idea of what could have happened, I would love to hear your thoughts and theories. It's the first time I've shared this with anyone else, and so I'm a little bit nervous about this, but I thought that I would put it out there and see what other people's opinions may be. This happened back when I was 13. Me, my mum, my sister, and brother decided to go on a vacation in Morocco. At first, we wanted to rent an apartment for ourselves, but my grandma who lives there invited us to stay at her 70-year-old home. Me and my siblings hesitated a bit because we had heard stories about what happened in that home. Faint voices, footsteps, etc., etc. My mum changed our mind though and brushed the stories off. She claimed that they were lies just to scare us, and we told her that if we experienced something creepy that we would immediately leave the house and stay at our aunt's house. But for now, the vacation had started. We went to the beach nearly daily, we went shopping and bought a lot of souvenirs, and we chilled at the house a bit. Now, one night, we tried to sleep, but it was way too hot. Temperatures were around 30 to 40 degrees Celsius. So we decided to sleep on the roof. It's not really a roof though, it's more like an open roof room at the top of the house. We cleaned the floor first though and laid down on the mattresses and the blankets there. My brother fell asleep first, then my sister, and at last myself. I slept quite well for a couple of hours. There was a slight breeze and it was quiet, until the silence was broken by someone calling my name. It was a soft and soothing voice. I slowly opened my eyes and stood up to walk to the door. I first answered with a "Yes, who's calling my name?" to no reply. Then I walked to the stairs and leaned over the railing to look down. And what I saw, I have never told another soul. I looked down and saw a girl in a white dress looking back up at me, but her neck was way too elongated for her to be human. Then the girl just sort of turned around and walked away until I couldn't see her anymore. Well, I decided to quickly shut up and try to get some sleep and to go back where others were, but I couldn't. I don't know who that was, and I was starting to believe in the rumors about this house at this stage. Recently, my grandma told me about a 12-year-old girl that had apparently ended her own life by jumping off the roof there or something that we were sleeping on. I was genuinely shocked and was 100% sure that the girl that I had encountered that day was the one who had done it. It was a very frightening experience and something that I will never forget. When I was 13 years old, I went camping with my school at some point. When I arrived, I noticed the camping spot was just some tents in a dark and creepy forest. The tents were also small, and we even had to share a tent with 12 other people. I liked the activities that we did. We built a boat, we played football, and we roasted marshmallows around a campfire. When it was time for sleeping, I chose the bed all the way at the back. I opened my suitcase and realized I did not bring my pajamas. So I slept with my normal clothes on for the next 3 to 4 hours. Until I was awoken by a loud rumbling noise. I slowly turned around and 2 tall creatures hunched over my suitcase. They were searching for something, I thought. I reached my arm out to touch whoever this person was, and I felt something harsh. If I were to describe it, I would say that it felt something like old wood. After I had touched it, though, I asked who it was, and then I just sort of blacked out. In the morning, I was woken up by my alarm on my phone. We were not allowed to bring a phone, so I was sure that I had turned my alarm off before sleeping. So how could this have happened? I asked myself many questions. I know that it wasn't the other kids. I had not even told them that I had my phone with me, neither did I know them well, but they didn't seem like jokesters to me. My alarm woke up most of the kids in the tent. They asked whose it was, so I acted just like I was sleeping to avoid being suspected. We had to wake up at around this time anyway, so I jumped out of bed and I walked outside. It was really cold and I really had to pee at this stage. I walked around the tent and I peed in the bushes. I turned around and I saw a dead rabbit right outside of where I slept. I called the teacher and he told me that it must have been killed by something, and he said that he could call staff to clean it up if I wanted. This day was not really that interesting. I mostly just sort of laid in bed eating candy and thinking about what happened that night. It quickly turned to dark and we roasted some more marshmallows and we ate some pasta that night. The pasta was actually cold and stale, but I was hungry, so I didn't care that much. 1 hour later, and it was almost bedtime, and my teacher had told me that if I wanted to go to the bathroom at night, I would have to go in a duo because the forest is very dangerous at night. I didn't think too much of it, but I chose my duo just to be sure. Then it was bedtime, and I made my bed, and eventually I fell asleep. Again, though, I was woken up, but this time not by weird creatures, but by my urge to pee, and so I tried waking up my duo, but he just didn't want to wake up. So in the end, I decided to go alone. I walked all the way out to the front of the tent, waking some up in the process, and I walked out. It was cold and really dark at this stage. In fact, I could barely see. I looked over to the benches, and there it was again, looking at me. It was tall, and it seemed to have something in its hands. It looked like an animal, but I was stood still looking at it for maybe about 20 seconds until I decided to just continue walking to the toilets. I opened the toilet door and I did my business. I washed my hands and I left. And when I returned back at the benches and looked again, the creature was now gone. I don't know what it was, but no one else seemed to have seen it, only me. If anyone knows what this could have been, then please do tell me, because I genuinely have no idea. Back when I lived in Georgia, Columbus, I lived in this really old, terrible house on a property developed back in the late 1800s. The guy who originally bought the land and developed it was a real piece of works, because the property has like 9 different soil types on it, so he could make his own personal little paradise garden, and as someone with severe allergen issues, that kind of screwed me a lot living there. All except during the particularly heavy rains that washed away the literal waves of pollen and the rare snowy winters that we had there. Anyway, it's one of these rare snowy winters. I want to say, I forget the exact year to be honest, but late aughts I think. Or maybe it was early teens. Maybe some other poor sucker in Georgia can remind me when we had a good hard snow Columbus ways between maybe 15 and 20 years ago. But me and my dad are doing stuff around the house, i.e. he's drinking hard because he's a retired Marine, and Marines all have drinking problems to cope with PTSD. Obviously I'm being sarcastic, but he really did have a drinking problem at the time, and I'm awake despite the late hour, so he has someone other than my mum to pester with his incessant talking. Seriously, get my dad going when he's drunk and he's worse than a SoCal Valley girl. We're loading the fireplace though, the dogs are sleeping. We see the firewood pile is low and both go out to grab some more firewood. By which I mean mostly me carrying it because Dad's drunk and he's about to fall over. In any case, it's no longer snowing super hard, but it's still going and it's foggy as heck out there. There's a funeral home on the top of the hill beyond the house. It's past this sort of mid-sized retaining pond or pit that keeps our house from flooding when it rains real bad here, and the parking lot of the home had a couple of streetlights as well. From the lights nearest our house though, me and my dad see a silhouette out against the snow. It's small, maybe just over 4 feet tall, which says child, and me and my dad, being the at least halfway decent people that we are, start going up to see what the heck this is all about. I mean, why is there a kid out here at 0 dark 30? And we find this kid. He cannot be more than 10, maybe 11 years old, pale as death like he's been out in the snow for hours, and all he's wearing is a nightgown. He looks terrified and he's shaking and just stares at us, not saying a word. Dad sobers up almost instantly and gently tells the kid to follow us. Well, we gotta get him inside. I mean, he's gonna freeze to death out here. I agree, and we reach out to offer him a hand, but he recoils away and doesn't touch me. But he nods a bit when we gently invite him in, promise to get him warmed up and maybe something to eat or drink, and follow us down the hill and into the house. His face lights up immediately as soon as he's past the back door and in what is ostensibly our laundry room. He stops shivering. He stops looking scared, and he just looks calm, content now. Dad and I turn to rush off to get him some blankets, towels, set up a space heater and all that. We both turned away from him for less than 2 seconds, and I turned back around real quick because I was going to ask him if he wanted soup or maybe some chicken or something. And he was just gone. Disappeared like a fart in the wind. I grab Dad's arm and he turns back, and he almost turns as white as the kid was, which is impressive for someone who is visibly half Cherokee and thus much more red than white. But the kid is just 100% gone. We look outside, we weirdly see no footprints. The boy was barefoot, but the only tracks that were made were me and my dad's boots, nothing else. Dad and I just stared at each other for a while. Dad was clearly questioning whether or not he had some kind of a drunken hallucination, except for the fact that I was there and I had seen the boy too. And I mean, I almost never touch booze, so that was definitely not a hallucination on my end. Over the following week and a half, the both of us asked around about a boy in a nightgown, and it wasn't until Dad mentioned it to old Mrs. Funderburg. She died at like 98. She was only 96 at this point, so she'd been around for a long spell, but that's when we got an answer. Well, sort of anyway. According to Mrs. Funderburg, when she was a child and the area was a lot less developed, before she was born there was an old ghost story about a boy who had been found dead in a rare Georgia snowstorm not far from where our house was. Apparently, this boy was also in nothing but a nightgown. Nobody knew how or why. All anyone had was guesses, but it wasn't uncommon for people to claim seeing a boy, or at least his silhouette, in our area in the dead of night during really bad snowstorms. But nobody had ever gotten close enough to him before. He'd always just run off or disappeared into the snow or the fog or whatever. The best guess that me and my dad could come up with after Mrs. Funderburg told us all that we knew is that the kid must have gotten locked outside of his house or something. I can also only hope by tragic accident rather than active cruelty or whatever, but it was during some major blizzard. There was a pretty bad one in 1910 apparently, but for my part I always figured that it must have been the Great Blizzard of 1899, and just couldn't get back in. Judging by what me and my dad saw, The boy had been pretty damn frail, and he would have been frozen to death quickly once the mercury went to like 32 Fahrenheit or lower or whatever. But he disappeared when we brought him inside. It's been a while since that happened, at least 15 years now, and nobody I've spoken to, including people who used to live in our immediate vicinity, has seen anything like me and what my dad saw. And sometimes, even now, I find myself wondering if that was actually real or just me and my dad having some sort of a shared hallucination somehow. Had that kid been there all this time? Was all he wanted is to be invited into someplace warm, maybe somewhere he used to live, and that was good enough? I can still see his face when I think about it. The half-frozen, scared little face. Did it really take 100-some-odd years or more for someone to even care enough to try and bring him out of the cold like that? If that's the case, that is truly tragic. So my best friend and I are both from London, but her family on her dad's side is from Ireland, so she goes there every summer for the entire summer. Last summer, too, I went to go and stay with her for a couple of weeks at her granddad's house. And her granddad lives in rural Ireland, like really rural. The town is at least a 40-minute drive away, and his house is the only building within the area. It also backs onto a massive forest and faces onto a lake, too. It's really quite beautiful, to be honest, but that's not the point. You see, my best friend's granddad, brother, aunt, and dad were going to the pub one evening. They invited us, which was of course a tempting offer, but we declined as we were excited at the prospect of having the house to ourselves, something that doesn't happen a lot given that we were teenagers. So we decided to have a bit of a chill evening and basically play house. Of course, if you've been to Ireland, then you know that a quick pint is anything but quick. And her family, they had been gone for some time by this point, a few hours at least, when it was approaching 10 p.m. We were watching a movie in her living room when we heard a knock on the door. We figured that maybe it was her family who had forgotten their keys, so we went to go and answer. Her granddad's front door led onto the conservatory, which then led to the actual front door of the house, so we made it to the conservatory door expecting her family, but instead there was a man at the door. Slightly confused, we kind of just looked at him waiting for him to say something, during which I had time to take in his appearance. There was something off about him, to say the least. He sort of looked insane, bizarrely alert and yet slightly scary. It's sort of hard to explain, but he said that his car had broken down and he needed to use the phone to call someone to pick him up. I looked out but couldn't see a car anywhere and said something to the effect of, "Well, where's your car?" He responded by explaining that he had broken down about 30 minutes down the road and had walked until he had found a house. Now, given that, as I explained prior, my friend's granddad lived in a fairly remote area, this was sort of plausible. With slight hesitation, my friend passed him her phone and said that he could call who he needed to call and wait on the doorstep. But he didn't accept the offer. Instead, he just kind of ignored it and started asking if there were any adults or parents in the house. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt and assume that he was asking this as maybe he felt more comfortable sharing this predicament with adults rather than two teenage girls. But we didn't know if we should tell him that we were alone or not because we would usually know better than that, but given the situation we explained that they were out but they may be back any minute now. It was then that he started to sort of look past us and into the house and then began insisting that we let him in the house as he wanted to use the landline. At this point, we were more than suspicious because if he wanted to call someone, why not just use my friend's phone? He was erratic all of a sudden, continuously insisting that we let him in. At that point, my friend said that he either use her mobile or that he needs to leave, but beyond that, there was nothing more that we could do for him. He again insisted that he come into the house, so we just shut the door on him, locked it, and then locked the door to the actual house as well. Freaked out, we sat in her living room trying to peep out the window and see if he had gone. He lingered for a little bit, looking into the windows, maybe looking for a way in, I suppose, but then we saw him leave. Though we couldn't make out what direction that he actually went in. We were now pretty terrified, and to add fuel to the fire, my friend explained that the nearby town was pretty small and everyone in the area pretty much knew each other, and she had never seen him in her life, which scared her as she was acquainted with most of the town by now. We contemplated calling her dad, but since it had been about 30 minutes with no disruption, we decided to just leave it and continue on with our night. Later on, her dog was getting restless and her family was still out, so we let her into the back garden, and after about 5 minutes we heard her barking, but it was too dark to see what she was barking at, so we put it down to more than likely being a goat because that was usually the case. We called her in and we just went about our night. We realized that her family probably wouldn't be back until the early hours, and instead of waiting for them, we decided to head up to bed. I went into the kitchen, which is at the back of the house, to get some water when I heard someone shaking the handle of the back door, trying to get in. The thing is that it's a really old house, so I didn't exactly put all my faith in the door holding up against the weight of what I expected to be a grown man. I screamed bloody murder, and my friend ran down the stairs. At this point, he was banging on the door like his life depended on it, and I swear to you that I felt my heart fall out of my butt. My friend shouted back that she was going to call the police, which was a lie as she had taken our phones upstairs, but she thought that it may deter him. And luckily, this seemed to finally scare him off. He stopped banging and we heard his footsteps move further and further away until we couldn't hear them anymore. We were literally frozen in fear and couldn't even speak to each other. Then we heard the front door open and we pretty much thought that that was it for us. On instinct, my friend grabbed a knife and we hid in the pantry. And you can only imagine our relief when we heard her dad call out for us saying that they were back. We were absolutely dazed, and I'm sure that they could tell, so we frantically asked them, "Did you see a car on your way here, or a broken car, or whatever?" And they responded that they didn't, and I swear to you that I nearly defecated myself just then and there. We never did find out who that man was. The guys went out and took a look around, but they never found anything. And while I don't know everything about what was going on, obviously, one thing was for certain. He was trying to get into this place, and he definitely did not have good intentions. My son CJ, 4, appears to have an entity bothering him. He calls him his fake dad, creepily enough. He's mentioned him for a while now, but anytime that we ask questions about fake dad, he usually changes the subject. At first, we laughed about it, thinking it was a strange name for an imaginary friend, but I'm starting to think that that may not be the case. You see, recently it's been escalating. Last week, CJ told us that he used to have a fake mum, but she drowned in the ocean. Creepy, but we were driving back from the beach at the time. We asked if fake dad was with us, and he said no, and that he didn't really want to talk about fake dad. Tonight, my husband and I were eating dinner after CJ had gotten up to play, and we heard him say to himself, "Ouch, that was a bad idea. I should have never listened to him." We asked him what he meant, and he told us that fake dad had told him to walk across his new train track, his new birthday present that he loves. CJ told us that fake dad always tells him to do bad things like break his toys. He hasn't done this yet, but tonight was the first time he really opened up about fake dad. He also told us that fake dad gets mad when he hugs his real dad. He was pretty upset and told us that he doesn't like fake Dad and wishes that he would leave him alone. As I'm sharing this, CJ started crying from his bedroom as well. I went to check on him, thinking that he was messing around and hurt himself or something, but the lights were still off and he had fallen off of the bed, which he has never done before. He was confused about how it could have even happened as well. This is escalating quickly now, and I'm just wondering what kind of entity this is and how I can help my son. Also, last night we heard a loud bang coming from CJ's bedroom. I went to check on him, but the lights were off and I could see CJ in bed, and honestly it looked like he was asleep. I was standing in the doorway trying to figure out what had caused the noise when my husband walked up behind me. Suddenly, CJ sat up in bed and said, "He told me that you could come." I asked CJ who told him that, and he then pointed to the corner of the bedroom and said, "Fake Dad." I looked to where he pointed, and I swear to you that I could see a silhouette of a very large man standing in the corner in the dark. My husband saw the same thing and quickly turned on the light, but when he did, nothing was there. Well, we packed some bags and we left for the night. I mean, there was no way that anyone was going to sleep in that house, and honestly, I'm not sure I ever want to even go back there. We're at my aunt's house now, and we're going to talk to her priest this afternoon to see what we can do. It just feels like I'm living in a horror movie. I mean, what the heck is this thing, and how can I get it to leave my child alone? So, to protect the building itself, an old hospital, since it still exists and is vacant, I won't share its name and I'll be vague on the location, but I can assure you that the story is true. So I've been an EMT going on 19 years, and in those years I worked for many a different ambulance agency. One agency that I worked for was a hospital-based 911 inter-facility ambulance provider. Bit of a mouthful, I know, but that's what it's called. Now, because it was owned and run by a hospital company, many of our stations were in the hospitals themselves. One of these hospitals was a small rural hospital in a very small town in New Jersey. Years ago, smaller hospital companies like the one that I worked for were struggling financially, and larger corporations came in to buy out the smaller ones. Now, when this company came in, it decided to close permanently this hospital, and it was a gradual closure, but it happened. First, they shut down medical floors and other services, but kept the ER open, but only during normal business hours. This too was shut down months later, and our station here was pretty much unaffected, and we had 24/7 access to this now empty human hospital. Well, this wasn't a full-time station of mine. I did work out there on a handful of occasions before they sold the building and moved the station elsewhere. Now, imagine a hospital empty of anyone, except one small office for an EMS crew. Everything was still in the hospital rooms and offices, obviously, just lacking humans. It was creepy having this building once full of life and energy, now silent and dormant. Anyways, I came in one morning and the ambulance crew that I would be relieving was out still. I get to the station at around 4:45 a.m. for a 5 a.m. clock-in time. It was my first time at this station, and like many other humans, I was curious about what this empty hospital was like. So, since I had a little bit of time, I started walking around the old hallway silent and sort of just admiring what the building once was. I walked into the old chapel, the ICU, and other areas briskly to not forget I'm actually there to work soon. The EMS office was also just located off of the main entrance and the waiting room. I'm walking back to this EMS office to punch in, and as I'm walking back, I swear that I start hearing whispering, clear as day whispering voices. At first, I couldn't tell where they were coming from until I started getting closer to the waiting room. They got louder, but they were still whispers, if that makes sense. I was thinking, okay, well, maybe the one security guard that they had staffed was sitting in there on a phone being silent or something. But as I walked into the dark waiting room, nothing. No one, and the voices suddenly stopped. I punched in, and not much of my time was spent there during the day, but days later I was working there again, and this time I'm working with somebody else who has also never worked there before. Like me, she was just as curious about the building, so I took her around the areas that I knew of and told her about what I had witnessed only a few days earlier. We were once again walking back to our office near the waiting room. We were just talking when she interrupts me and asks me if I heard something. I didn't, but the silence revealed what she was hearing. Once again, we start hearing whispering voices. Clear voices, but not hearing what is being actually said. As we try to find the source this time, it was coming from an old office just outside of the waiting room. As we walked in, nothing. It was empty except for a desk. And the voices stopped again. It was amazing that I had someone there to tell me that I wasn't just hearing things this time and witnessed exactly what I did. After that, I unfortunately never had a chance to work out there again as the hospital got sold and the station was relocated elsewhere and all that. But this building still exists to this day, vacant and waiting for redevelopment, I suppose. Last time I drove by it, it was untouched, surprisingly. I'm going to start off by saying and acknowledging just how absurd I might sound to all of you. And look, I know that you might think that I'm fabricating this story for internet clout or something, but I want to assure you that I'm not. I know that I cannot force you to believe me, nor will I attempt to do so, but I'm going to share what happened during one summer in my youth. First, I'll explain why I believe this wasn't a mistaken memory or hallucination too. So my family has lived on our land for nearly 200 years now. We have taken care of this land and it has cared for us in turn. It is my ancestral home in a very real sense too. That said, our land has seen a few odd occurrences over the years for sure. I don't claim that our land is haunted or anything, but I do share my grandma's belief. She believes that our ancestors are looking down on us, protecting our family as a sort of guardian angel. It's a comforting feeling, at least to me, and I've never really felt unsafe on our land. My grandma has told me of some paranormal experiences that she has had over the years. Many occurred on our land, but one particularly relevant event to this story, it happened elsewhere. Now, during a cruise trip to the Caribbean, she and my grandpa were on shore on an island. My grandpa had gone ahead on a trail while my grandma had lagged behind a little bit, and as she was cresting a hill, a young girl ran up behind her. The child appeared to be scared of something, pointing to the bay and yelling that a ship is coming. My grandma tried to comfort the child, looking upwards towards the bay. She saw a sailing ship, like the ones from colonial times. The ship was far off, but she said that it was hard to discern, almost like a mirage. She said that she had called out to my grandpa before turning back to the child. However, when she turned back, the child was gone. No sound of her running off, no footprints, nothing. My grandma told me this story years ago, describing what she experienced as a bit of a time slip, an odd overlap of present and past that manifested in a, for a lack of a better term, ghost ship and child. I share this story to establish a bit of a history of odd occurrences that happened to some of our family members. It appears to be that more of them have occurred to me than my brother, despite us being pretty much inseparable when we were younger. But anyway, my time slip occurred during a summer when I was about 9 or 10. That summer, two friends had spent most weekdays with us as their mum had to work. Most days we would just play video games or explore the woods on our property or whatever. And it was on one of the days that we decided to explore when this event occurred. Our group of 4 were following my brother's dog, She was wandering through some game trails with us, making mild conversation, and we debated what would happen if we got lost. I said that we could eat some twigs and leaves, which solicited laughter from our group. After we walked through some brush, we came upon a fence line that I was familiar with but didn't see often. My memory then grows really hazy here. The others were with me, but they weren't involved in the time slip. My brother's dog had crossed the fence line, and I had followed despite the land that I was entering not being ours. I recall ducking under the middle strand of wire, and when I came up, the woods, they had just vanished. Obviously, as you can imagine, I was very confused, as anyone would be. I looked around for our dog, but I couldn't find her. I did notice, however, how similar the scene before me looked. It was a fenced clearing that was an acre in size. I recognized the acre-sized clearing where my home should have sat, and I was puzzled as to what I was even looking at. The fence looked much newer, and the 3 mesquite trees were nothing more than saplings. The windmill creaked with the wind, but a blade that was broken my entire life was now undamaged. The sun shone a little brighter than normal. The entire time I felt sort of dazed, like in a lucid dream almost. After a few moments, I got an uncanny feeling and decided to turn back. And when I crossed back, I turned and saw the woods had returned to normal. I cannot recall much after that, but that would simply be due to the event happening over a decade ago, I suppose. I know in some cultures that crossing a boundary of some kind could result in crossing over into another dimension or whatever. Though far-fetched, it could be another explanation besides a time slip, I guess, but despite trying to replicate the event, I have thus far been unable to. I wonder if anyone else has experienced this phenomenon and could possibly shed some light on what the heck it is that I encountered.